Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a cold so extreme it doesn't just threaten your life. It actively rewrites the rules of human survival. Imagine a place where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, where your breath doesn't just fog the air but falls to the ground as tinkling ice crystals, where the temperature gauge reads -71 degrees Celsius and the locals shrug because, well, it's January. You're heading to Yakutia in Russia's Far East, the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth, and you're about to discover that at these temperatures, survival isn't about toughness or willpower. It's about physics, luck, and one fragile fire that's starting to sputter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you in sunny California at noon? Or maybe it's 2 a.m. in Berlin. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the battered Antonov and biplane onto a runway that isn't really a runway. More like a strip of compacted snow that groans under your boots. The plane's engine coughs into silence behind you, and in that instant, the cold hits like a physical wall. Your first breath sears your nostrils shut. Your second breath makes your lungs ache as if you've inhaled broken glass. The air here at -71 degrees Celsius isn't just cold. It's a hostile element, almost solid in its intensity, and your body immediately begins screaming alerts that this environment wants you dead. Welcome to Oymyakon, a village of roughly 500 souls who've somehow convinced themselves that living here makes sense. The name itself is deliciously ironic. It derives from a Yakut word meaning unfrozen water, referring to a nearby thermal spring where reindeer herders once watered their animals. Unfrozen water. In a place where the January average sits around -50 degrees Celsius and the record low hit -71.2 degrees Celsius in 1924, though locals whisper it's dropped even lower in years the Soviets didn't bother recording. You're here because of a documentary assignment gone catastrophically wrong. Your film crew was supposed to capture life in extreme cold for a nature series, but your helicopter developed mechanical issues 200 kilometers south and limped back to Yakutsk, leaving you and 3 others stranded at a weather research station that hasn't seen supply runs in 3 weeks. The station's main generator died yesterday. Your satellite phone's battery lasted about 40 minutes in the cold before giving up entirely. And the backup rescue? Delayed by the same brutal high-pressure system that's pushing temperatures to record lows. So here you are, 4 people, 1 wood-burning stove with dwindling fuel, and no realistic hope of extraction for at least 72 hours. Maybe longer if the weather worsens. And it's definitely worsening. The research station is a Soviet-era brutalist cube, all concrete and tiny windows, designed by someone who understood that surface area equals heat loss. You push through the outer door into an Arctic entry, a buffer zone that's only -30 degrees Celsius, balmy by comparison, then through the inner door into the main room where your 3 companions huddle near the iron stove. First, there's Dmitri, a reindeer herder in his 60s with a face carved from mahogany and creased by 6 decades of Yakut winters. He speaks little Russian and less English, but his eyes hold a calculation you're starting to recognize. He's measuring how long the fuel will last, how cold it'll get, who's most likely to panic. Dmitri wasn't supposed to be here either. He'd stopped by the station 2 days ago seeking medical supplies for his herd and got trapped by the temperature drop. Next to him sits Yulia, a geologist in her 40s who spent 20 years surveying Yakutia's mineral wealth for various Soviet and post-Soviet concerns. She's got that particular brand of Russian pragmatism that comes from living through the 1990s collapse, the kind that accepts catastrophe with a cigarette and a dark joke. She's already rationing the station's food supplies into depressing little piles. Then there's Svetlana, a Yakut grandmother who serves as the station's part-time cook and caretaker. At 73, she's survived more Yakut winters than you have years on this planet, and she's currently feeding the stove with the careful precision of someone who knows exactly how much wood creates how much heat for how long. The iron beast crackles and pops, its surface glowing faintly orange. And finally, there's Alexei, the truck driver who'd been delivering supplies when his Ural 4320, a Soviet-era military truck known for its ridiculous cold weather capabilities, finally met its match. Something in the fuel system crystallized. The engine block cracked despite the antifreeze. He's 32, built like a bull, and currently staring at the stove with the hollow eyes of someone realizing that muscle means nothing against thermodynamics. You make 5, the accidental documentary filmmaker with expensive Gore-Tex gear that's proving woefully inadequate, and a growing suspicion that your insurance policy didn't cover freezing to death in Siberia. The stove squats in the center of the room like a medieval deity. It's a simple box of iron, maybe a meter tall, with a pipe rising through the ceiling. Fire dances behind the grate, fed by chunks of larch wood from a pile that's shrinking faster than anyone wants to acknowledge. The heat extends perhaps 2 meters in any direction before surrendering to the cold. Beyond that radius, frost creeps along the concrete walls in intricate fractal patterns. Here's your first crash course in extreme cold physics. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, materials behave in ways that seem almost supernatural. The steel window frames contract and groan. The concrete itself becomes brittle. Outside, the wooden utility poles that carry power lines that stopped working yesterday, crack with sounds like rifle shots as the moisture inside them freezes and expands. Metal tools left outside become so cold they'll rip the skin off your palm if you're foolish enough to grab them with bare hands. And your body is a tropical machine trying to operate in Martian conditions. You're burning calories at 3 times your normal rate just to maintain core temperature. Your heart is working overtime to keep blood flowing to your extremities. Your fingers and toes are already the first casualties. Your body's autonomic nervous system has begun the calculus of sacrifice, restricting blood flow to your digits to preserve your core. Svetlana says something in Yakut. Dmitry nods and translates into broken Russian for Yulia, who turns to you. She says we have enough wood for maybe 2 days if we're careful. 3 if we let the fire die at night and restart it at dawn. You do the math immediately. Rescue in 72 hours minimum. Fuel for 48, maybe 72 if you're willing to endure the nighttime temperatures without heat. The margins are razor thin, and everyone in this room knows it. What happens if we let the fire die? You ask, though you already suspect the answer. Yulia lights one of her precious cigarettes with a twig from the stove. The room reaches equilibrium with outside temperature in maybe 4-5 hours. We'd be sleeping in minus 60 degrees Celsius, maybe minus 65 degrees Celsius. You'd need to wake up every hour to check for frostbite. If you sleep too deep, she shrugs in that particularly Russian way that contains entire novels of fatalism. Alexei speaks up for the first time in an hour. My grandfather survived the siege of Leningrad. He told me they slept in shifts, always moving, never letting the cold settle into their bones. Maybe we do the same. It's not a terrible idea, actually. The human body can endure remarkable cold if it stays active, keeps blood flowing. But it's also exhausting, and exhaustion leads to mistakes, and mistakes at minus 71 degrees Celsius are frequently fatal. Dmitry has been silent, watching the fire, but now he stands and moves to the window. The glass is coated with frost on the inside. Yes, the inside, forming patterns so beautiful they could be art installations. He scrapes a small circle clear with his thumbnail and peers out into the darkness. What he sees, what you'd see if you looked, is a landscape rendered alien by cold. The moon hangs above the horizon, casting blue light across endless snow. The village of Oymyakon is barely visible, just a handful of lights in the distance, each one representing a family that's made peace with this impossible cold. Smoke rises from chimneys in perfectly straight columns. The air is so still and cold that it can't even muster a breeze. This is what meteorologists call an extreme high-pressure system, where air masses become so dense and frigid they simply sit, immovable, crushing the land beneath them. And above it all, faint but growing, the aurora borealis, ribbons of green and violet dancing across the sky. It's breathtaking and utterly indifferent to your survival. Dmitry turns back to the group and speaks in Yakut. His tone is measured, informative. Yulia translates. He says in the old days, before the Soviets, before permanent villages, the Yakut people were nomadic. They never stayed in one place during the deep cold. They followed the reindeer, kept moving, and they understood that fire was not something you owned but something you negotiated with. You gave it what it needed, and it gave you life. If the deal broke down, you died. Simple. Very inspiring, Yulia adds dryly. Unfortunately, we can't exactly pack up and migrate to warmer pastures. But Dmitri isn't finished. He continues speaking, and Yulia's translation becomes more uncertain. He's talking about, I think he's saying there are old survival techniques, ways his grandparents survived when they got caught in the cold. Something about breath control and ice houses? My Yakut is not so good for traditional knowledge. Svetlana interrupts, her voice sharp and commanding despite her age. She and Dmitri have a rapid exchange, and you catch the word Saka several times, the Yakut people's name for themselves. Finally, Svetlana turns to address the group, and even without understanding her language, you can tell she's delivering instructions, not suggestions. Yulia translates. Svetlana says we're thinking about this wrong. We're thinking like outsiders, like Russians and foreigners who see the cold as an enemy to defeat. But the Saka people learned 10,000 years ago that you don't defeat minus 71 degrees Celsius. You don't even survive it, not really. You make a deal with it. You give it respect, you take only what you need. And you remember that this land was frozen before you were born and will be frozen after you die. That's beautiful philosophy, Alexei says. But philosophy doesn't burn in a stove. Svetlana smiles, actually smiles, and says something that makes Dmitri laugh, a sound like grinding gravel. Yulia shakes her head. She says city people always think warmth comes from fire, but fire just moves heat around. Real warmth comes from knowing how to hold the heat your body makes. She's going to show us. And this is where your education in extreme cold survival truly begins. Taught by a 73-year-old woman who's probably forgotten more about staying alive in Yakutia than you'll ever learn. Svetlana moves around the room with surprising energy, pulling items from cabinets. She produces a pile of reindeer hides. You hadn't even noticed them stored in the corner, and begins demonstrating a layering technique that's less, put on a coat, and more, construct a personal microclimate. The hides get arranged fur-side inward against your body, creating air pockets that trap heat. Over that, your modern synthetic layers. Over that, another hide, fur out, to break the wind and repel frost. She's muttering the whole time, and Dmitri translates key points. Never sweat. Sweat is death. You sweat, it freezes, you die. Move slow, breathe slow, think slow. Fast equals hot equals sweat equals death. It's a mantra that makes perfect sense once you understand the physics. Your expensive North Face parka is designed to wick moisture away from your body. Great for alpine climbing at minus 20 degrees Celsius, catastrophic at minus 71 degrees Celsius, where that wicked moisture instantly becomes ice crystals embedded in your clothing. Yulia watches Svetlana work and mutters, during Stalin's time, they sent thousands of prisoners to camps right here in Yakutia. Dalstroy camps, they were called. The guards used to say they didn't need fences. The cold was the fence. Prisoners who tried to escape would make it maybe 10 kilometers before the cold killed them. She takes a long drag on her cigarette. Historians still argue whether the camps were labor projects or just slow-motion execution, but when I was surveying the old sites, I found journals. Some prisoners figured out what Svetlana's teaching us. They survived by learning from the Yakut people, the ones who worked as guides and suppliers. The ones who didn't learn, well, we still find bodies sometimes, preserved perfectly in the permafrost. There it is, the historical weight of this place settling over you like frost. Yakutia isn't just cold. It's a graveyard of failed colonization attempts, of Soviet hubris meeting Siberian reality, of thousands of years of indigenous knowledge carved from frozen necessity. The fire pops, sending sparks against the grate. Outside, a wolf howls, the sound carrying for kilometers through the dense, still air. Inside, 5 people from 3 generations and 4 different backgrounds huddle around iron and flame, making calculations about wood and time and heat. You're now wearing what feels like 15 kilograms of hides and fabric, transformed into something between a human and a walking insulation experiment. You're warmer, genuinely warmer, but also acutely aware that this warmth is borrowed, temporary, and dependent on a fire that's consuming wood at a rate that doesn't favor optimism. Svetlana finishes her preparations and settles back near the stove. She pulls out a small pot and begins melting snow for tea, a process that takes longer than you'd expect because even next to the stove, water doesn't exactly rush to boil. While it heats, she tells a story in Yakut, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of practiced oral tradition. Dmitri provides fragments of translation. Long ago, a hunter caught in a storm built a fire inside a snow cave. The fire melted the cave. He rebuilt it, again and again, survived 3 days. His family found him alive, but Dmitri pauses, searching for words. His fingers and toes were black. They had to cut them off. But he lived. He married, had children, became a great teacher of winter survival. He would say, the cold takes payment. You can choose what to pay, or the cold chooses for you. It's a cheerful bedtime story if your definition of cheerful includes consensual amputation as a survival strategy. But the point lands. At -71 degrees Celsius, you're not going to escape unscathed. The only question is how much you'll lose and whether you'll be alive to regret it. The tea finally steams, and Svetlana pours it into chipped enamel cups. The liquid is dark, bitter, and absolutely glorious as it spreads warmth through your chest. This is another survival trick. Hot liquids help maintain core temperature far more efficiently than trying to heat your body from the outside. You all sit in a rough circle around the stove, cups warming your hands, the fire crackling its ancient song. For just a moment, there's something almost peaceful about this scene. 5 strangers bound by circumstance and cold, sharing heat and hope. But then Alexei asks the question nobody wanted to voice. What happens if the rescue doesn't come in 3 days? The silence that follows is broken only by the fire and the occasional groan of contracting metal somewhere in the building's skeleton. Finally, Yulia speaks, her voice flat, factual. Then we make new plans. We discuss burning furniture, sections of flooring, maybe parts of the walls. We discuss whether to attempt walking to the village. It's 7 kilometers, which in this cold with proper preparation might be survivable. Or we discuss rationing the fire to maybe 5-6 days and hoping the weather breaks. Or, Dmitri says quietly, we trust that we are not the first people to face this. We trust what the land has taught the Saka for 10,000 winters. We stay calm, stay smart, and we remember, you are not trying to conquer -71 degrees Celsius. You are just trying to be interesting enough that it lets you keep living for one more day. Outside, the temperature continues its relentless fall. The aurora intensifies, curtains of light rippling across the sky like the breath of some cosmic entity. And inside, 5 people settle in for their first night, feeding the fire carefully, monitoring their extremities for numbness, and trying very hard not to calculate the odds too precisely. Because at -71 degrees Celsius, precise odds are just another word for despair, and despair, like sweat, is another thing that can kill you. The physics of extreme cold doesn't care about your feelings, your survival instincts, or the fact that you're a tropical ape who evolved near the equator. At -71 degrees Celsius, you're operating in a temperature range where the fundamental rules of matter start expressing themselves in ways that would seem like magic if they weren't so terrifyingly real. Let's start with air itself. The atmosphere you're breathing has become something closer to a liquid in its density. At this temperature, oxygen molecules are moving so slowly that the air feels thick, resistant. Each breath you take requires slightly more effort, and if you're not careful, if you breathe too deeply through your mouth, you can actually freeze the delicate tissues of your lungs. This isn't hyperbole or scaremongering. This is documented medical reality. The moisture in your respiratory system crystallizes instantly when exposed to -71 degrees Celsius air, which is why Dmitri keeps demonstrating the proper breathing technique. Small breaths through your nose, where the convoluted passages can warm the air slightly before it reaches your lungs. Exhale slowly through pursed lips. You practice this breathing pattern, and it feels absurd, like you're doing some kind of extreme yoga. But within 20 minutes of conscious breathing, you notice the difference. Your chest doesn't ache quite as much, your throat doesn't feel scraped raw. Svetlana nods approvingly each time she catches you doing it right. She's been watching everyone, you realize, monitoring for the small mistakes that compound into catastrophe. Outside, The dark Yakutia night presses against the windows. You volunteer for the first watch. Someone needs to stay awake to feed the fire every 45 minutes. And this gives you time to really observe what -71 degrees Celsius does to the world. The window frost has grown thicker, more elaborate. You hold your candle, battery-powered lights are being conserved, close to the glass, and watch the patterns shift slightly from the heat. They're called hoar-frost fractals, and they form because water vapor in the air doesn't just freeze at these temperatures. It undergoes deposition, transforming directly from gas to solid crystal without passing through a liquid phase. The patterns follow mathematical rules, branching at consistent angles, creating structures that look intentional, designed, almost conscious. Through the small clear patch Dmitry scraped earlier, you can see the research station's exterior thermometer. It's an old Soviet model, alcohol-based because mercury freezes at -39 degrees Celsius, making it useless in Yakutia. The red line sits at -73 degrees Celsius. The temperature is still dropping. At -73 degrees Celsius, steel becomes brittle enough to shatter. You learned this fact from a documentary years ago, but experiencing it is different. Every 30 minutes or so, you hear a sharp crack from somewhere in the building, a bolt contracting, a weld failing, metal surrendering to the cold. The station is slowly tearing itself apart at the molecular level. Yulia is still awake, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She's wrapped in reindeer hides near the stove, sipping tea and watching you watch the night. Finally, she speaks. You want to know the worst part about extreme cold? It's not the pain. Pain you can fight. Pain gives you something to push against. It's the numbness. First your fingers, then your thoughts. The cold doesn't hurt you to death. It just makes you care less and less about staying alive until one day you sit down in the snow and think, just 5 minutes rest, and you never get up. She's describing the advanced stages of hypothermia, where the brain starts shutting down non-essential functions, including the survival instinct itself. It's a phenomenon well documented in mountaineering disasters and polar expeditions. People found frozen to death are often partially undressed, having removed their protective clothing in a paradoxical state called terminal burrowing behavior, where the dying brain misfires and tells the body it's overheating. Did you see a lot of that? You ask. In your survey work? Yulia nods slowly. Enough. We'd find old camps from Stalin's time and sometimes bodies, perfectly preserved, like they died yesterday instead of 70 years ago. The permafrost is a time capsule, keeps everything. She pauses, choosing her words carefully. There's a debate among Russian historians about how many people died in the Dalstroy camps. Official Soviet records say maybe 15,000. But the graves we kept finding, the bodies that turned up whenever we drill for mineral samples. Some scholars think it could be closer to 100,000. Maybe more. Historians still argue whether the discrepancy is from poor record-keeping or deliberate concealment. You feed another log into the stove, watching sparks dance upward through the pipe. The wood is Larch Larix gmelinii if you want to get scientific about it, a tree species that evolved specifically for Yakutian conditions. Larch is deciduous, unusual for a conifer, dropping its needles each fall because maintaining them through a Yakutian winter would require more energy than the tree possesses. Even the plants here understand the calculus of sacrifice. Let part of yourself die so the whole can survive. The log catches and heat pulses outward. You position yourself to maximize exposure, and that's when you notice something odd. Your left hand, the one that had been resting against your thigh, is completely numb. Not cold numb, but absent numb, like it's simply stopped existing. Panic flares. You've been warmed by the fire. You're wearing proper layers. How can you already have frostbite? Svetlana appears at your elbow like a grandmother-shaped ninja, takes your hand in hers, and examines it with the clinical efficiency of someone who's treated 10,000 frozen appendages. She says something sharp in Yakut, and even without translation, you understand. You idiot, you let your hand rest against the cold fabric of your pants too long. She begins massaging your hand, not roughly, but with firm, methodical movements designed to restore circulation without damaging potentially frozen tissue. The sensation returning to your fingers is exquisite agony, like being stabbed with hot needles. You gasp, and Svetlana nods approvingly. Pain means tissue damage isn't permanent. It's numbness to pain to numbness to blackness you need to worry about. That's the progression of dying flesh. First lesson. Yulia translates as Svetlana continues working. At -70 degrees Celsius, everything is a heat sink. Metal, stone, fabric, flesh. Everything wants to reach equilibrium with the air temperature. Your hand was maybe 20 degrees Celsius. Your pants, even insulated, maybe -30 degrees Celsius. That 50-degree difference? It flows fast. 5 minutes of contact and you start losing tissue. The massage continues for another 3 minutes until your hand feels mostly normal, if by normal you mean on fire and throbbing. Svetlana releases you with a final admonishment that needs no translation. Don't be stupid again. This is the insidious nature of -71 degrees Celsius. You can do everything right, stay near heat where proper layers maintain awareness, and still one moment of inattention, one wrong surface contact, one forgotten extremity, and your body begins the process of controlled demolition. Alexei stirs from his sleeping position, woken by your gasps. He sits up, checks the fire out of habit, and then notices the sky through the window. Aurora's incredible tonight. He's right. The northern lights have intensified into a full display, waves of green and violet, and sometimes red cascading across the sky like divine curtains. It's the kind of sight that would draw tourists from around the world if those tourists could somehow survive getting here. The aurora borealis is caused by solar wind, charged particles from the sun, colliding with Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere. The colors depend on which atmospheric gases the particles excite. Oxygen produces green and red, nitrogen creates blue and violet. It's a purely physical phenomenon. But standing here in a frozen Soviet research station at -73 degrees Celsius, watching those impossible lights ripple and dance, it's hard not to feel like you're witnessing something transcendent. My grandmother, Alexei says quietly, used to say the aurora was the spirits of unbaptized children playing in heaven. Not very scientific, but prettier than talking about solar particles. Dmitri has woken too, disturbed by the movement and voices. He looks at the aurora, then says something that makes Svetlana chuckle darkly. Yulia translates. He says the Saka people traditionally believed the aurora was the dance of the dead, and you should never whistle at it or wave your hands because it might notice you and come down. Children who disrespected the aurora would be carried off into the sky. Cheerful, you mutter. Survival cultures don't do cheerful, Yulia replies. They do respect the things that can kill you. The fire needs another log. You're burning through fuel faster than the conservative estimates suggested, partly because the temperature outside keeps dropping, now -74 degrees Celsius according to the thermometer, and partly because the building itself is such a poor insulator. Soviet construction prioritized speed and cost over efficiency, which worked fine when you had reliable supply lines and unlimited fuel. It works less well when you're rationed and trapped. You check your watch. 2:47 a.m. Sunrise is still 4 hours away, though sunrise at this latitude and season is generous. You'll get maybe 5 hours of dim, slanting light that barely qualifies as daytime before darkness reclaims everything. Dmitri stands and moves to a corner of the room where he's stored his personal gear. He returns with a small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns that look like stylized reindeer and trees. From inside, he produces what looks like a bundle of dried meat. Yakola, Yulia identifies. Dried fish, traditional Saka food. Dmitri offers pieces to everyone. The fish is frozen solid, of course, everything's frozen. But you follow his example and place a small piece in your cheek, letting body heat slowly soften it. The flavor is intense, salty, slightly oily, and deeply satisfying in a way your body recognizes as valuable calories and fat. While you're working on the yakola, Dmitri begins to speak. His voice is soft, almost rhythmic, and you realize he's telling a story. Yulia translates in fragments. Long before the Russians came, before even the Mongols, the Saka people lived in a land where winter lasted 9 months and summer was 3 months of mosquitoes. They survived because they understood the cold wasn't evil, it was just hungry. Everything in Yakutia is hungry. The land, the cold, the wolves, even the spirits. If you're smart, you feed them what they need before they take what they want. There was a young hunter, this is maybe 300 years ago, maybe 3,000, stories don't count time the same way, who went out after elk in the deep winter. He was strong, skilled, and proud. Too proud. He didn't make offerings to the spirits of the cold. He didn't respect the signs. The way the ravens flew, the color of the sunset, the taste of the air. The cold came for him, not slowly like it usually does, but fast like a living thing. The temperature dropped so fast his breath froze in his lungs. His rifle cracked from the cold. His elkskin boots turned hard as stone. He knew he would die, but he remembered something his grandmother taught him. The cold is hungry, but it can be bargained with. So he made a fire, just a small one, barely enough to keep a candle lit, and he spoke to the cold. He said, "Take my toes. They're yours. But leave me my life, because I have children who need a father." And the cold, hearing this honest offer, accepted. When his family found him 2 days later, following the smoke from his tiny fire, he was alive. His toes were black, dead, gone. But he lived. He taught his children everything his grandmother taught him, and his children taught their children. And this is why we're still here, still alive after 10,000 winters. The story hangs in the air, mingling with smoke from the stove. You notice that everyone has unconsciously checked their own extremities while listening, wiggling toes inside boots, flexing fingers, making sure everything still responds to commands. Is that a true story? You ask. Dmitri shrugs elaborately. Yulia smiles. In Yakutia, true is complicated. Did that specific hunter exist? Maybe, maybe not. But have 10,000 hunters faced that exact choice and made that exact bargain? Absolutely. The story is true even if the man is myth. Svetlana adds something and Yulia laughs. An actual laugh, the first you've heard from her. She says anthropologists from Moscow used to visit, trying to record authentic Saka oral traditions before they were corrupted by modern life. They'd get so frustrated because every storyteller told the same stories differently. Different names, different details, different endings. The anthropologists thought this meant the culture was degrading, losing coherence. But Svetlana says the anthropologists were idiots. The stories change because life changes. A story that doesn't adapt is a dead story, and dead things don't survive Yakutian winters. You feed the fire again. The wood pile has visibly diminished. By your calculation, you've burned through nearly a quarter of the available fuel in just 6 hours. At this rate, you're looking at maybe 30 hours of heat, not the optimistic 3 days. But saying this aloud would accomplish nothing except spread panic, so you keep the math to yourself and instead ask Yulia about the science of cold survival. Something to keep minds active and focused. She stubs out her latest cigarette and settles into what you recognize as lecture mode. Okay, so, basic thermoregulation. Your body maintains a core temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, that's a 108-degree difference between your core and the environment. Heat flows from hot to cold. This is thermodynamics, this is law, this cannot be negotiated. So your body is constantly hemorrhaging heat, and your metabolism has to work harder and harder to replace it. Problem 1. The extremities. Your fingers, toes, nose, ears, they have high surface area relative to volume, which means they lose heat fast. Your body responds by vasoconstricting, narrowing blood vessels to reduce heat loss. Less blood flow means less oxygen, less nutrients. Tissue starts dying. That's frostbite. Problem 2. Your core. As your body fights to warm your extremities, your core temperature drops. Below 35 degrees Celsius, you're hypothermic. Mild hypothermia. You shiver, you're confused, your judgment fails. Moderate hypothermia. Shivering stops. Not because you're warmer, but because your muscles can't generate the coordinated movements anymore. You stumble, slur words, make catastrophic decisions. Severe hypothermia. Below 28 degrees Celsius, you're essentially dying. Heart arrhythmias, unconsciousness, death. Problem 3, the mind. Your brain is a glucose-hungry organ, and in extreme cold, your body starts rationing glucose to muscles that need it for heat generation. So you get stupid, not metaphorically, literally cognitively impaired. You forget to eat. Forget to check for frostbite. Forget that sitting down in the snow is a bad idea. Comforting, Alexei mutters. I'm not trying to comfort you, Yulia says. I'm trying to educate you. Because if you understand what's happening, you can fight it. You can force yourself to eat even when you're not hungry. You can check your extremities on a schedule even when you don't feel like it. You can recognize when your thoughts aren't making sense anymore and ask for help. Dmitri has been listening carefully, and now he nods and speaks. Yulia translates. He says this is good knowledge, scientific knowledge. But there's another kind of knowledge, body knowledge, land knowledge. He says in the old times, before thermometers and medical words, the Saka people understood cold the way a wolf understands hunting. You don't think about each step. You feel it, you know it. When to move fast, when to move slow. When to eat fat, when to drink warm liquid. When to sleep, when to stay awake. Modern people lost this knowledge, he says, because they started trusting machines instead of trusting their bodies. Until the machines break, you say, gesturing at the dead generator in the corner, at the useless satellite phone. Until the machines break, Dmitri agrees in Russian, one of the few phrases he knows. The wind, absent for hours, suddenly moans against the building. It's not a strong wind, the high-pressure system is still dominant, but even a slight breeze at minus 74 degrees Celsius carries a catastrophic chill factor. The effective temperature against exposed skin would be approaching minus 90 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze flesh in under 30 seconds. Everyone instinctively moves closer to the stove, tightening the circle. Svetlana begins preparing more tea, and you realize this is her way of maintaining morale. Small rituals, small comforts, small reasons to keep engaging with life instead of surrendering to the seductive whisper of the cold that says just rest, just sleep, just let go. The Yakutia gets passed around again. Alexei produces a small flask, vodka naturally, and offers it. Svetlana shakes her head firmly and launches into what's clearly a well-practiced lecture. Yulia grins and translates. She says alcohol makes you feel warm by dilating blood vessels, but that actually increases heat loss. People who drink in extreme cold die faster. She's seen it 100 times. Drunk men who think vodka will save them, found frozen in the morning. Alexei looks sheepish but still takes a small sip himself before putting the flask away. Just for courage, he mutters. Outside, the aurora has begun to fade as the first gray hint of pre-dawn touches the eastern horizon. In a few hours, you'll have light. Light won't make things warmer, but it'll make them feel less hopeless, less like being trapped in an infinite frozen void. You're tired now, deeply tired, but also wired with the kind of alertness that comes from sustained adrenaline. Your watch shift ends in 20 minutes, and then Alexei will take over fire duty while you try to sleep. But first, Svetlana wants to teach one more lesson. She gestures for everyone to stand and begins demonstrating a series of movements. Small, controlled exercises designed to maintain circulation without generating sweat. Flex your toes inside your boots 20 times. Rotate your ankles. Tense and release your calves. Work your way up the body, engaging each muscle group just enough to keep blood flowing. You all follow her lead, this strange midnight exercise class in a frozen Soviet research station while the aurora dances its farewell outside. And despite everything, despite the dwindling fuel and the relentless cold and the uncertain rescue, there's something almost meditative about this shared ritual of survival. The thermometer outside now reads minus 74.5 degrees Celsius, possibly the coldest temperature you'll ever experience in your life. If you're very lucky, it's the coldest temperature you'll ever experience and still live to remember it. The fire crackles. The building groans. 5 people flex and breathe and check their fingers and toes, negotiating with the cold 1 minute at a time. The fire has become the center of a universe that extends roughly 2 meters in every direction before surrendering to absolute cold. You've stopped thinking of yourselves as individuals and started thinking as a collective organism with one shared purpose: keeping this fire alive. Because when the fire dies, you die. The math is really that simple. It's been 14 hours since the temperature began its catastrophic plunge. The outside thermometer, which you've all stopped checking quite so obsessively, as if not looking might somehow stop the mercury from falling, reads minus 76 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, you've entered territory so extreme that even among cold weather researchers it's considered a statistical anomaly, the kind of cold that happens maybe once or twice per decade even in Yakutia. Dmitri is awake now, taking his turn at fire management while the rest of you attempt sleep in shifts. But sleep at these temperatures isn't really sleep. It's more like controlled unconsciousness where part of your brain remains vigilantly aware that relaxing too much, getting too comfortable might mean never waking up. You drift in and out, hyper-aware of every sensation. The pressure of the reindeer hide against your cheek, the ache in your hip from the hard floor, the eternal cold pressing against every surface like a living presence trying to find a way in. Dmitri is humming something, barely audible, a melody that sounds older than Christianity, older than Buddhism, old as the land itself. You open your eyes and watch him work. His movements around the fire are economical, practiced, the product of 60-some winters learning the language of flame and wood. He's not just feeding the fire. He's reading it, interpreting the color of the flames, the pattern of the smoke, the way the heat distributes itself through the iron stove. He notices you watching and gestures for you to join him. Sleep was proving impossible anyway, so you extract yourself from your cocoon of hides and move closer to the fire's warmth. Dmitri points to the flames and begins speaking in Yakut, slowly, as if teaching a child. He picks up a piece of larch, shows you the grain, the density, the slight oiliness of the wood. Then he demonstrates. He doesn't just throw the log on the fire. He positions it precisely, angled to catch the updraft, placed where it will burn slowly and completely rather than flaring bright and fast. The lesson is clear even without shared language. Fire management at -76 degrees Celsius isn't about creating maximum heat. It's about creating sustainable heat. Every log has to earn its consumption, burning as long and efficiently as possible. He hands you the next log, watches as you attempt to replicate his placement. Your first try is clumsy, the log rolls, disrupting the existing burn pattern. Dmitri shakes his head, retrieves the log with a metal poker, and guides your hands to show the correct angle. The second attempt is better. He nods, satisfied, and returns to his humming. Svetlana stirs, her old woman radar apparently sensing that lessons are being taught. She sits up, wraps a hide around her shoulders like a shawl, and moves to join you by the fire. She and Dmitri have a brief exchange in Yakut, and then she begins pulling items from her seemingly infinite supply of survival gear. First, a small leather pouch containing what looks like dried moss. She takes a pinch and holds it over the fire. The moss catches instantly, burning with surprising intensity and a pleasant, slightly sweet smell. She says a word in Yakut, tinder. Not just any moss, you realize, but specifically prepared tinder fungus, probably Phomys fomentarius, which grows on birch trees and has been used for fire starting for literally thousands of years. Otzi the Iceman, that 5,300-year-old mummy found in the Alps, was carrying tinder fungus in his pouch. This is ancient technology, older than agriculture, older than pottery, as old as the human relationship with fire itself. Svetlana demonstrates how to prepare the moss, how to store it so it stays dry, how to use it to catch a spark or ember and nurse it into flame. Then she produces another item, a small bow drill, beautifully crafted from what looks like bone and sinew and hardwood. She doesn't actually demonstrate making fire with it, that would waste precious heat energy, but she pantomimes the motion, shows you the components, makes sure you understand. The message is clear. If you know these things, if you carry these skills in your hands and memory, you're never completely helpless. The fire might die, but you can resurrect it. This knowledge is itself a kind of warmth. Yulia has woken up too, drawn by the quiet activity. She sits cross-legged near the stove, lights one of her diminishing cigarettes, and watches Svetlana's lesson with an anthropologist's eye. You know, she says, when I was doing survey work in the 1990s, just after the Soviet Union collapsed, I met old Saka hunters who still knew how to survive with nothing but what they could carry on a reindeer. No GPS, no satellite phones, no emergency beacons. Just knowledge and skill and an intimate understanding of this land. She pauses to exhale smoke. I asked one old man, he was probably 90, maybe older. I asked him what he thought about modern survival gear, all our fancy technology. And he laughed. He said, technology is wonderful until it breaks. Skills never break. You can lose your rifle, your tent, your radio, but if you know how to find water under ice, how to read weather in the clouds, how to build fire from nothing, how to navigate by stars and wind patterns, these things stay in your hands and head until you die. Did you learn from him? You ask. Some things. Enough to recognize how much I didn't know. He tried to teach me ice fishing. There's a lake system about 40 kilometers north where even in winter you can find open water if you know where to look. The fish there are slow, lethargic from the cold, easy to catch if you can reach them. He showed me how to identify the ice thickness by color and sound, how to cut through 2 meters of ice with nothing but patience and a bone chisel, how to... She stops abruptly, and you see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She turns to Dmitri, speaks rapidly in Russian. He responds, equally animated. Svetlana joins the conversation, which escalates from discussion to argument to what sounds like planning. Finally, Yulia turns to you and Alexei, who's also woken up. Dmitri knows those lakes. He says in this cold, the ice would be at least 3 meters thick, maybe 4. But there's a traditional fishing spot where thermal vents keep a small section thinner. It's about 7 kilometers from here, roughly toward the village but slightly south. Alexei immediately sees where this is going. You want to go outside in minus 76 degrees Celsius to go fishing? I want to talk about options, Yulia says. We have maybe 24 hours of fuel left. Maybe 30 if we ration aggressively, but that means colder nights, higher risk of frostbite. The village is 7 kilometers. The fishing lake is 7 kilometers in a slightly different direction. If we could catch fish, even just a few, we'd have high-calorie food to help maintain body temperature. Plus, the walk itself would help us understand if evacuation on foot is even possible. It's not a completely insane idea, which somehow makes it more terrifying. You're actually discussing whether to voluntarily leave the only heat source in a 100-kilometer radius to go walking through minus 76 degrees Celsius weather on the hope of catching fish through 3 meters of ice. Dmitri speaks, and this time you catch a few Russian words mixed into his Yakut. Tomorrow. Like, decision. He's right. This isn't a conversation to have at 4 a.m. in the dark. This is a conversation for daylight, when you can assess the weather, check everyone's physical condition, and make a rational decision rather than a desperate one. The fire needs another log. You place it carefully using Dmitri's technique and watch it catch. The wood is definitely lower now. Alexei has noticed too. You catch him staring at the diminishing pile with an expression that contains no hope at all. To break the silence, you ask Svetlana something you've been wondering. How did people here survive before matches, before modern fire-starting tools? How did they keep fire alive through a Yakutian winter? Svetlana's answer, translated by Yulia, is both simple and profound. They didn't let it die. When the Saka people were nomadic, following the reindeer herds, there was always someone responsible for carrying the fire. Usually an elder woman, someone steady and careful. The fire would be kept in a special container, bone or stone, packed with slow-burning moss and bark. When the group moved, the fire moved. When they made camp, that ember would birth the new fire. Some families, their fires had been burning continuously for generations. Centuries, maybe. The fire was literally an ancestor. What happened if it went out? Alexei asks. Then you hope to find another family quickly. Or you use the bow drill, though in deep winter that's hard, your hands get too cold to maintain the friction. Or, Svetlana's voice drops, takes on a different quality. Yulia translates carefully. Or you didn't survive. The land is full of stories about groups who lost their fire and froze. The land remembers them. Sometimes you find their bones, still arranged around a cold fire pit, like they died waiting for warmth that never came. It's a ghost story, essentially, but ghost stories in survival cultures serve a purpose. They're educational horror, teaching through fear what shouldn't be taught through experience. The conversation has thoroughly destroyed any possibility of sleep, so you all settle into an impromptu planning session. Svetlana produces dried berries, you're not sure what species, but they're tart and surprisingly good. Dmitri shares more Yakola. Yulia rations out tea leaves like they're gold dust, which in current circumstances they basically are. While the tea steeps, Alexei tells his story. You've all been so focused on immediate survival that the social niceties of getting to know you have been skipped. But now, in the pre-dawn cold with the fire crackling and nothing else to do, the stories emerge. I've been driving trucks in Yakutia for 12 years, Alexei says. Mostly supply runs between Yakutsk and the northern mining operations. I've driven through minus 60 degrees Celsius, minus 65 degrees Celsius, even minus 68 degrees Celsius once. You learn tricks. Keep the engine running always, because if you shut it down it might never restart. Carry extra fuel, extra oil, extra antifreeze. Sleep in the cab with the heater on. Never, ever stop for long. He stares into the fire. 3 years ago, I was running a route in January. Weather report said minus 55 degrees Celsius. Manageable. But the temperature dropped fast, hit minus 67 degrees Celsius in about 4 hours. The truck started making sounds. Metal contracting, joints failing. I knew I had to turn back, but the road was empty. No settlement for 80 kilometers in either direction. So I kept going, and I prayed to a God I'm not sure I believe in, and the truck held together just barely long enough to reach a village. When I stopped, when I finally shut the engine off, I got out to check the damage. The entire exhaust system had cracked. The suspension was fractured. The tires had flat spots from the cold. That truck should have fallen apart. By all logic, by all engineering principles, it should have catastrophically failed. But it didn't. It got me to safety, and then it died. I had that truck scrapped rather than repaired. Gave it a kind of funeral, actually, poured vodka on the engine block, said a few words. My friends thought I was crazy. But that truck saved my life. And in Yakutia, you respect the things that keep you alive. There's a moment of contemplative silence, broken by Dmitri speaking. Yulia translates. He says machines are like fires, they have spirits too, maybe. Treat them well, feed them what they need, speak to them with respect, and sometimes they'll give you more than they should. Treat them badly, take them for granted, and they'll fail when you need them most. It's animism, technically, the attribution of soul or spirit to non-living things. Most modern societies consider this primitive superstition. But sitting in a frozen research station at minus 76 degrees Celsius, dependent entirely on the spirit or not spirit of a fire to survive, the distinction between metaphor and literal belief seems less important than the practical outcome. Respect the things that keep you alive. Yulia checks her watch. 2 hours until sunrise. Well, until the sky gets less dark. Sunrise is generous. You all settle into waiting, that particular purgatory of extreme situations where time becomes elastic, stretching unbearably. To pass the hours, Svetlana begins teaching another traditional skill. How to work with hide and sinew to create clothing repairs. She shows you a tear in Alexei's coat. He'd snagged it on metal yesterday, and demonstrates stitching it closed using a bone needle and what appears to be actual animal tendon as thread. The process is meditative, methodical. Each stitch has to be tight enough to close the gap, but not so tight that it weakens the material. The sinew, when wet with saliva, one of the few liquids that doesn't freeze instantly, becomes pliable. When it dries, it contracts and hardens, creating a bond stronger than the original fabric. You try a few stitches under her guidance. Your first attempts are clumsy, but Svetlana is patient, correcting your hand position, showing you how to feel the tension. This is craft knowledge, the kind that takes years to master but provides immediate, tangible results. In Soviet times, Yulia says, watching Svetlana work, there was a big push to modernize indigenous peoples. Sakha children were sent to Russian schools, taught that their traditional ways were backward, primitive. They were supposed to learn factory work, collective farming, proper Soviet professions. A lot of traditional knowledge was lost in one generation. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly those factories closed, those collectives failed, and people who'd been taught to depend on the state found themselves with nothing. The ones who survived best were the ones whose grandparents had secretly kept teaching them the old ways. How to hunt, trap, fish, sow, navigate the land without technology. Svetlana adds something, her voice sad. Yulia translates. She says her own daughter moved to Yakutsk, works in an office, wears heels and makeup, beautiful, successful by modern standards. But if you dropped her daughter in the taiga in winter, she'd be dead in a day. Svetlana's granddaughter is even worse. She doesn't even speak Sakha anymore, only Russian. Svetlana says sometimes she wonders if she failed as a teacher, or if the world just changed too fast. Historians still argue whether Soviet modernization was cultural genocide or genuine progress. Yulia adds, probably it was both. It gave people education, healthcare, opportunities. But it also severed connections to land and tradition that had sustained communities for 10,000 years. And now we're in this weird in-between space where people want traditional knowledge but lack the context for it. They want to honor their heritage but also have Wi-Fi and smartphones. The fire needs feeding again. The wood pile is noticeably depleted. You add a log using Dmitri's careful placement technique, and it strikes you that you're learning survival skills you'll hopefully never need again while simultaneously betting your life on those exact skills. Outside, the darkness is finally, grudgingly yielding to a gray pre-dawn glow. The aurora has long since faded. The stars are disappearing. Through the window, you can see the village of Oymyakon in the distance, its few lights looking impossibly far away. Dmitri stands and moves to the window, scrapes frost away, and studies the sky with the concentration of someone reading a complex text. He speaks, and Yulia translates. He says the weather is stable, high pressure still dominant, which means the extreme cold continues, but also means no wind, no precipitation, good visibility. If we're going to attempt anything, fishing, evacuation, whatever, today is the day. Tomorrow the weather might break, temperatures might rise, which sounds good but actually means storms, wind, whiteout conditions. So there it is, the universe offering a narrow window of terrible options. Stay here and ration the fire to maybe 30 more hours. Risk the walk to the fishing lake in hopes of catching food. Risk the walk to the village in hopes of reaching safety. Each choice has its own calculus of probable death. Alexei voices what everyone's thinking. How do we decide? Svetlana responds immediately, firmly. Yulia translates, we don't decide alone. We decide together. We vote, we argue, we consider everyone's strength and weakness. Because if even one person disagrees, if even one person thinks the choice is wrong, that doubt will kill us as surely as the cold. We must all commit fully, or we don't do it. It's leadership wisdom from a 73-year-old woman who's survived more winters than your combined ages. And it makes perfect sense. In extreme survival situations, group cohesion is as important as any physical resource. The sunrise, such as it is, arrives at 9:47 a.m. The sky transitions from black to dark gray to slightly less dark gray, and the landscape becomes visible. Endless white, broken only by the dark vertical lines of distant large forests and the tiny geometric shapes of Oymyakon's buildings. The thermometer reads -75 degrees Celsius. The temperature has stopped falling, at least. Small mercies. Dmitri and Svetlana begin preparing for a possible expedition, sorting gear, checking clothing, assembling tools. Yulia inventories the food supplies and calculates caloric needs. Alexei examines everyone's boots and outerwear for damage that could prove fatal outside. And you stand at the window, staring at the frozen world, trying to calculate odds that ultimately can't be calculated. Because at -75 degrees Celsius, survival isn't really about mathematics or planning or preparation. It's about something older, something that lives in the part of your brain that still remembers when humans were prey animals trying to survive in hostile worlds. It's about making a deal with the cold and hoping the cold keeps its end of the bargain. The decision-making process begins with tea and dried fish, because even when you're discussing whether to risk death by freezing, you're still human animals who need fuel and ritual. Svetlana has arranged 5 small piles of supplies on the floor near the stove, one for each person, and she's demonstrating what she considers the absolute minimum gear for any excursion into -75 degrees Celsius weather. Each pile contains extra reindeer hide strips for wrapping feet and hands, a small pouch of the tinder fungus, a portion of dried fish and berries, a bone knife, and a length of sinew rope. She holds up each item and explains its purpose through Yulia's translation, treating this like a sacred inventory, which in a sense it is. The hide strips, Yulia translates, are your first line of defense against frostbite. Every 30 minutes outside, you stop and check your extremities. If you feel numbness, you add layers. The tinder is obvious. If you get separated from the group, you can make fire. The food is for energy. Your body will be burning calories at an insane rate. The knife is for everything from cutting shelter materials to emergency field medicine. The rope is for staying connected to each other in whiteout conditions, though today the visibility is good. Dmitri adds his own items to the piles. Small wooden toggles carved from larch. He demonstrates how they work. You can bite down on them if your face starts to go numb, using the hardness to stimulate circulation in your jaw and cheeks. It's such a simple, elegant solution that you wonder how many frozen faces had to be lost before someone invented it. Alexei has been studying the map, a faded Soviet-era topographical chart that shows the area in surprising detail. The fishing lake Dmitri mentioned is here, he points. 7 kilometers almost due south. The terrain is relatively flat. Easy walking if the snow isn't too deep. The village is 7 kilometers northeast. Also flat, but we'd be walking slightly into the wind, whatever wind there is. What about the research station itself? You ask? Is there anything we haven't searched? Any hidden fuel stores, emergency supplies, something we've missed? Yulia shakes her head. I've been through this building 3 times. What you see is what we have. The Soviets built these stations cheap and expected regular resupply. They never imagined anyone would be trapped here for days. Dmitri speaks, and even before the translation you can hear the seriousness in his tone. Yulia listens carefully, then relays. He says we need to understand something fundamental. In traditional Saka culture, decisions about winter travel were never made lightly. The elders would consider the weather, the season, the purpose of the journey, the strength of the travelers. They'd make offerings to the spirits of the land and wait for signs. Sometimes they'd decide the risk was too great and simply not go, even if the need was urgent. He says modern people, Russians, foreigners, even young Saka people, they think willpower can overcome nature. They think if you're tough enough, determined enough, you can force your way through anything. This thinking kills people. The land doesn't care about your determination. The cold doesn't respect your courage. You survive by being smart and humble, not brave. Svetlana nods emphatically and adds her own commentary. Yulia translates. She's seen it over and over. Strong young men who think they can walk through a blizzard and end up frozen a kilometer from safety. City people who panic and run instead of staying put and building shelter. Even experienced hunters who got overconfident and made one small mistake that cascaded into catastrophe. So what's your recommendation? Alexei asks. Stay or go? There's a long pause. Dmitri and Svetlana exchange looks, conducting some kind of silent elder-to-elder consultation. Finally, Dmitri speaks at length, his hands moving expressively, painting pictures in the air. Yulia translates in segments. He says, if this were summer or even normal winter, -40, -50, he would say walk to the village without hesitation. 7 kilometers is nothing. 3-4 hours of steady walking. But at -75, every factor is multiplied. Sweat becomes lethal. Exhaustion becomes lethal. A twisted ankle becomes lethal. Even success becomes dangerous because the exertion required to walk 7 kilometers in this cold will leave you so depleted that you might collapse when you arrive. He says the fishing lake is actually safer in some ways because it's not about endurance, it's about skill. You walk there 3 hours maximum. You find the traditional fishing spot, you cut through the ice, you fish for maybe 2 hours, you walk back. Total time outside, 8 hours, maybe 9. You return here with food or without food, but either way you return. You're not betting everything on reaching a distant goal. But, Yulia continues, he also says both options are dangerous enough that if we were his family, his reindeer herding group, he would say we stay put and ration the fire to the absolute minimum. Sleep during the day when it's slightly warmer, stay awake at night maintaining a tiny fire. Make the fuel last 5, 6, maybe 7 days if we're disciplined. Accept frostbite as the price. Hope that rescue comes before we run out completely. The brutal calculus is laid out. Three bad options with varying probabilities of disaster. Yulia lights another cigarette. Her supply is also dwindling, and offers her perspective. From a scientific standpoint, the human body at -75 degrees is operating at the absolute edge of survivability. Studies of extreme cold exposure, most done on those poor bastards in Stalin's camps actually, show that even with perfect equipment and preparation, you're looking at severe frostbite after 6 to 8 hours of exposure. Your core temperature will drop regardless of activity level. The question isn't whether you'll be damaged, but how much. She exhales smoke slowly. Historians still argue whether the data from Gulag medical experiments should be used at all, given how it was obtained. On one hand, people suffered to generate that knowledge. On the other hand, ignoring it means their suffering taught us nothing. I use it. Maybe that makes me complicit, I don't know. But it keeps me alive. Alexei stands and walks to the window, stares out at the frozen landscape. My vote is we try for the village. We're gonna suffer frostbite either way. Staying here, going outside, whatever. At least if we walk to the village, we're moving toward guaranteed shelter and heat. The fishing is a gamble. We might catch nothing. We might waste 8 hours and come back with empty hands and frozen feet. But if we catch fish, you counter. We extend our survival window here by days. We buy time for proper rescue with a helicopter instead of forcing ourselves into a desperate march. And if we don't catch fish, Alexei shoots back, we've wasted our best weather day and we're even weaker tomorrow. The argument is interrupted by Svetlana, who has been quiet but is now standing with an expression that brooks no disagreement. She speaks firmly, pointing at each person in turn, and you don't need translation to understand she's calling for order. Yulia translates anyway. She says we're arguing like frightened children. She says fear makes people stupid, makes them fight instead of think. She says we will do this properly. Each person will speak their position clearly, explain their reasoning, and then we will find consensus. This is the traditional way. This is the Saka way. This is the way that has kept people alive for 10,000 winters. She's right, of course. Panic and argument will kill you as surely as cold. You all settle back around the fire, chastened. Dmitri goes first. He speaks slowly, carefully, and Yulia translates. I vote for the fishing lake, not because I think it's safe, nothing is safe at this temperature, but because it plays to our strengths. I know exactly where the fishing spot is. I've fished there 50 times, maybe more. I know how to read the ice, where to cut, how to attract fish even in deep winter. We go together, we work together, we return together. If we succeed, we have food. If we fail, we still have the shelter here and most of our fuel remaining. Svetlana speaks next. I agree with Dmitri. The village is too far. I'm 73 years old. I can walk 7 kilometers, yes, but not at -75. I would slow everyone down. I would become a liability. At the fishing lake, I can help prepare the fishing holes, tend a small warming fire, process the fish if we catch them. I'm useful there. On a march to the village, I'm dead weight. Her honesty is shocking and admirable. She's not being self-pitying. She's being ruthlessly practical about her own limitations. Yulia is next. I abstain for now. I see valid arguments for both options. I need to hear everyone else before I can commit. Alexei grimaces. I already said my piece. Village. Direct route to safety. But I hear Svetlana's point, and I respect it. If we go to the village, we'd need to go slow enough for everyone to keep up, which means longer exposure, which means... He trails off, doing the same grim math you're all running. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the fishing lake makes more sense. All eyes turn to you. You're the newcomer here, the outsider, the one with the least knowledge of Yakutian survival. But Svetlana insisted on full consensus, which means your vote matters as much as Dmitri's 60 years of experience. You think carefully before speaking. I think we trust the people who've survived here the longest. Dmitri and Svetlana both say fishing lake. They have knowledge we don't have, instincts we don't have. We came here to document life in extreme cold, but now we're living it, and I vote we follow the wisdom that's kept the Saka people alive for millennia. Fishing lake. Dmitri nods approvingly. Svetlana actually smiles. Yulia stubs out her cigarette. Then I vote fishing lake as well. We're agreed. 5 for fishing, 0 for village, 0 for staying put. Dmitri, your expedition leader. What do we need to do to prepare? What follows is a masterclass in survival preparation. Dmitri has everyone stripped down to base layers so he can inspect their clothing for weak points. He finds 3. A worn seam on Alexei's coat that could split in the cold. A boot on your left foot that's slightly too tight, which will restrict circulation and cause frostbite. And a gap in Yulia's hood closure that's exposing her neck. Svetlana repairs the coat seam with her bone needle and sinew thread. She loosens the laces on your boot and adds an extra layer of hide around your foot to compensate. It feels bulky and strange, but Dmitri approves. The hood gap gets stuffed with moss and then stitched tight. Every person gets a wooden toggle to carry in their mouth. Extra hide wraps for hands and feet. A portion of tinder fungus in a waterproof pouch. Actually a piece of cleaned reindeer intestine, which Svetlana produces from somewhere and you try not to think about too hard. The dried fish gets divided into 5 portions and distributed. Dmitri produces fishing equipment you hadn't noticed before. Bone hooks, sinew line, and a traditional ice chisel carved from what looks like mammoth ivory. Mammoth? You ask, incredulous. Yulia grins. Yakutia is full of mammoth remains. The permafrost preserves them perfectly. Some of the ivory is 10,000 years old but still usable. There's a whole industry around it. The chisel is beautiful in its simplicity. A long, slightly curved piece of ancient ivory, one end sharpened to a brutal point, the other end wrapped in hide for gripping. Dmitri demonstrates the chipping motion used to cut through thick ice, and even in pantomime you can see this will be exhausting work. Next comes the most important preparation, the warm-up fire plan. Dmitri explains that they'll build a small fire at the fishing site using wood carried from the station. Not a big fire, that would waste fuel, but enough to provide a warming station where people can rotate through, thawing frozen fingers and toes while others work the ice. Svetlana is assembling the fire-starting kit with the care of someone packing explosives. Every piece of kindling is checked for moisture, impossible at these temperatures, but habits run deep. The tinder fungus gets extra protection. She packs a small metal pot for melting snow into drinking water, because dehydration in extreme cold is as dangerous as in extreme heat. Your body loses moisture with every breath, and you need to replace it constantly. The preparation takes almost 2 hours. By the time Dmitri pronounces everyone ready, it's nearly noon and the temperature has actually risen slightly. The thermometer now reads -73 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees of warming feels like a gift from the universe. Before leaving, Svetlana performs something that can only be described as a ritual. She takes a small wooden cup, fills it with tea, and pours it onto the floor near the stove while speaking in Yakut. Dmitri removes his hat and bows his head. Even Alexei and Yulia, who you suspect are both thoroughly Soviet in their atheism, show respect. What was that? You whisper to Yulia. Offering to the spirit of the fire, she whispers back, asking it to keep burning while we're gone, to welcome us home, to forgive us for leaving it alone. It's traditional, superstitious, technically, but she shrugs. At -73, I'll take all the help I can get, supernatural or otherwise. The fire does need to be maintained while you're gone. After some discussion, it's decided that Svetlana will stay behind. The fishing work will be too physically demanding for her, and someone needs to tend the fire, keep it alive, keep the shelter warm for your return. She seems relieved by this decision, though she hides it behind gruff efficiency. She makes each person promise to check their extremities every 30 minutes without fail. She makes Dmitri swear to turn back if the weather changes even slightly. She gives everyone a small piece of amber. For luck, Yulia translates. And because amber is warm in the hand, even in extreme cold, it reminds you that warmth exists. The amber is smooth, ancient, containing tiny insects that died millions of years ago and are now perfectly preserved. You slip it into your inner pocket where your body heat will keep it warm, and it does provide an odd comfort, this little piece of deep time. Dmitri performs a final equipment check, and then there's nothing left to do but open the door and face the cold. The outer door opens first, leading to the Arctic entry. The temperature hits you like a physical blow. You've been in relative warmth for hours, and your body has gotten comfortable, forgetting what -73 really means. Your first breath freezes your nose hairs solid. Your second breath makes your lungs ache. Dimitri demonstrates the breathing technique again. Small inhales through the nose, slow exhales through pursed lips, creating a rhythm that minimizes frozen lung tissue. You follow along, breathe, breathe, breathe. It becomes meditative, this careful management of respiration. The outer door opens to a world transformed by cold and light. The sun, low on the horizon, casts everything in shades of blue and white and gold. The snow squeaks under your boots. At this temperature, snow crystals are so hard they don't compress smoothly but rather fracture and crack with every step, creating that distinctive squeak that only happens below -40. Dimitri takes the lead, setting a pace that's deliberately slow. You're not racing, you're conserving energy and minimizing sweat. Yulia follows, then Alexei taking rear guard position. You're spaced about 3 meters apart, close enough to help each other but far enough to avoid bunching up. The landscape is so alien it could be another planet. The taiga forest in the distance looks like a photograph, perfectly still, each tree standing as if frozen mid-growth, which in a sense they are. At these temperatures, tree sap becomes solid, biological processes halt, life itself pauses. The sky is clear, achingly blue, and the sun provides light but almost no warmth at all. You walk and walk and walk. Your world narrows to the rhythm of steps and breath, the crunch of snow, the careful monitoring of your body's systems. Every 30 minutes, Dimitri calls a halt and everyone checks fingers, toes, nose, ears, any exposed skin. You're wearing so many layers that checking requires partially disrobing, which exposes you to even more cold, but it's necessary. Frostbite creeps up silently. After the second check, you notice your left foot, the one with the slightly tight boot originally, is starting to go numb despite Svetlana's adjustments. You mention this to Dimitri. He kneels in the snow, removes your boot completely. Your foot instantly screams in protest at the cold, examines your toes, adds yet another layer of hide wrapping, and gets the boot back on. The whole process takes maybe 90 seconds, but by the end your foot is a block of ice. Walk faster for 10 minutes. Yulia translates Dimitri's instruction. Generate heat in that foot. Then return to normal pace. You comply, and it works. The combination of increased circulation and better insulation brings feeling back to your toes. Crisis averted, for now. The fishing lake appears on the horizon after roughly 2.5 hours of walking. A vast white expanse barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain, except for the slightly different texture of the snow. Dimitri navigates unerringly to a specific spot marked by 3 stones arranged in a pattern only he seems to recognize. This is it, Yulia says. The traditional fishing spot. Now the real work begins. The first order of business is fire, because even though you've only been walking for 2.5 hours, everyone's extremities are screaming warnings, and your core temperature has dropped enough that your thoughts are starting to feel sluggish, crystallized. Dimitri selects a spot slightly upwind of where the fishing holes will be cut. You don't want smoke interfering with the fish, and begins the process of building a fire in conditions that seem designed to make fire impossible. The snow here is nearly 1 meter deep, so first Dimitri and Alexei dig down to frozen earth, creating a pit that will shelter the fire from any stray wind and prevent it from melting itself into the snow and extinguishing. The digging is brutal work. At -73 degrees, snow has the consistency of sand, each shovelful requiring real effort, and the exertion makes you want to breathe harder, which risks freezing your lungs. While they dig, Yulia and you gather materials. There are no trees immediately nearby, but Dimitri had the foresight to bring a small bundle of larch wood strapped to his back, and there are scattered pieces of driftwood, ancient flood debris from when this lake basin occasionally overflows in spring, poking through the snow like skeletal fingers. Svetlana packed the tinder and kindling with the precision of a surgical kit. Dimitri arranges it in the fire pit. First a base layer of the driest wood to keep the tinder off the frozen ground, then a nest of the fungus tinder, then a careful teepee structure of increasingly larger twigs. He produces a ferro rod, one concession to modern technology, and strikes it. Sparks shower into the tinder fungus, which catches almost immediately, glowing orange and releasing that sweet smoke. He feeds the young flame with the care of a parent nurturing a newborn. Too much fuel and it'll smother. Too little and it'll die. The wind, thankfully, is almost non-existent today. Just occasional breaths of air that make the flames dance but don't threaten to extinguish them. Within 15 minutes, there's a genuine fire crackling in the pit, and everyone takes turns holding frozen hands near it, feeling sensation return in waves of pins and needles. The psychological effect is almost as important as the physical warmth. Fire represents hope, control, human defiance of the void. Now comes the actual work, cutting through 3 meters of ice to reach water. Dmitri kneels at his chosen spot and begins scraping away the surface snow to expose the ice beneath. The ice is blue-white, so clear you can see air bubbles trapped inside it like prehistoric insects in amber. He taps it with the mammoth ivory chisel, listening to the sound, reading information you can't perceive. He's checking the thickness and structure, Yulia explains. Ice forms in layers as the season progresses. Each layer has slightly different properties: density, clarity, trapped air content. Experienced fishermen can read ice the way you'd read a book, identifying weak spots, thermal variations, even the presence of fish below by subtle changes in ice formation. Satisfied with his spot selection, Dmitri begins chipping. The technique is methodical. Strike at a slight angle, fracture off a chunk, clear the debris, repeat. The mammoth ivory chisel is perfect for this. Hard enough to chip ice without dulling, dense enough to deliver real force with each blow, slightly flexible so it doesn't shatter on impact. But even with perfect technique and perfect tools, cutting through 3 meters of ice at -73 degrees is an exercise in human endurance. Dmitri works for 20 minutes, then Alexei takes over. Then back to Dmitri. Rotation is essential because the work generates sweat, and sweat is still the silent killer. You discover muscles you didn't know existed. Each strike reverberates through your arms, shoulders, back. The ice chips fly up, occasionally hitting your face. Even through the layers of fabric, they sting like frozen wasps. After your first 20-minute shift, your arms are trembling and you're breathing hard enough that you need to cycle back to the fire to warm up and restore proper breathing rhythm. Yulia has been using her shifts at the fire to melt snow for drinking water. The metal pot sits at the fire's edge, and she's carefully rationing out warm water to everyone. Dehydration is a serious risk. Your body is using moisture at an incredible rate, both for respiration in the dry, frozen air and for the metabolic processes trying to keep you warm. You know, Yulia says during one of your fire breaks, I interviewed a climatologist once who'd spent 20 years studying Yakutian weather patterns. She told me that this region experiences temperature swings unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Summer can hit +30 Celsius. Winter can hit -70. That's a 100-degree range. The same piece of land, the same soil, the same rocks experiencing both extremes. She sips her warm water slowly. The question that fascinated her was, how does life survive that? How do trees not just explode from the stress? How do animals adapt to conditions that vary so wildly? And her answer was that life here doesn't fight the extremes. It surrenders to them. Trees go completely dormant, essentially dying and resurrecting each year. Animals either migrate or enter states of metabolic hibernation so deep they're barely alive. The land itself teaches a kind of radical acceptance. You can't resist these forces, so you learn to pause, endure, and wait for conditions to change. Comforting philosophy when you're trying not to freeze to death, you mutter. Actually, it is, Yulia says seriously, because it reminds you that this cold isn't permanent. Spring comes, summer comes. This -73 hell will end, either because we survive it or because we don't, but either way it ends. That thought keeps me sane. Dmitri calls out he needs the next rotation. You return to the ice hole, which has deepened significantly. You're maybe 1.5 meters down now, and the work is getting harder because you're chipping upward out of a narrow shaft, struggling with leverage and the need to constantly clear ice chips that accumulate at your feet. The hours blur together. Chip, clear, rotate, warm up, drink water, check extremities. Chip, clear, rotate. The sun crosses the sky in its low winter arc, providing that strange slanting light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and hostile. Somewhere around the 3-hour mark, you're too focused and exhausted to track time precisely. The chisel breaks through. Dmitri is on rotation when it happens, and he calls out excitedly in Yakut. Everyone crowds around to see. At the bottom of the shaft, maybe 3 meters down, there's water. Actual liquid water in a landscape where everything is frozen solid. How is that possible? You ask. Thermal vents, Yulia explains. Underground volcanic activity. Yakutia sits on ancient fault lines, and there are spots where heat from the Earth's interior rises up. Not enough to create hot springs usually, but enough to keep water liquid even when the surface is -73. It's what makes this fishing spot reliable even in the deepest winter. Dmitri widens the hole carefully, creating an opening large enough to fish through but not so large it becomes unstable. The walls of the ice shaft are smooth, almost glassy, and you can see the layers Yulia mentioned earlier, bands of slightly different opacity marking different freeze events. Finally, the hole is complete. Dmitri produces the bone hooks and sinew line, and you watch as he baits the hooks with small pieces of the preserved fish you carried as rations. It seems cannibalistic, using fish to catch fish, but apparently it works. The fishing technique is simple. Lower the baited hook into the water, let it sink to the desired depth. Then jig it up and down with small, rhythmic movements designed to attract attention. The cold has made the fish lethargic. Their metabolism has slowed to match the water temperature, but they're still hungry, still programmed to respond to movement that might be prey. Dmitri fishes first while the rest of you work on a second hole about 10 meters away. Yes, a second hole cutting through 3 meters of ice once was exhausting enough, but Dmitri insists that multiple holes increase the catch probability. The mathematics make sense. More hooks in the water equals more chances, and you've already invested the time and energy to get here. The second hole goes faster because you've refined the technique and because desperation is an excellent motivator. You're all acutely aware that you've been outside for nearly 4 hours now, that the sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon, that you need to catch fish and return to the research station before full darkness makes navigation dangerous. Yulia takes first rotation on the second hole's fishing line. The rest of you huddle by the fire, trying to retain warmth and conserve energy. Your feet are numb despite all precautions. Your hands are clumsy, barely able to grip. Your face feels like a frozen mask. This is deep into the danger zone for frostbite and hypothermia. And then Dmitri shouts he's got something. He pulls the line up with careful, steady movements. You can see it flexing, bending under weight, something substantial on the hook. Hand over hand, he retrieves the line, and finally a fish emerges from the shaft. A substantial specimen, maybe 40 centimeters long, silver-gray with the slightly prehistoric look of deep-cold fish species. It's a broad whitefish, Coregonus nasus, a species that thrives in Arctic lakes and rivers. The fish barely struggles. At these temperatures, even the few seconds of exposure to air have started freezing its skin. Dmitri dispatches it quickly with his bone knife, and even though you're not squeamish, there's something primal and slightly disturbing about watching a living thing become food. But also, you have food. Real, substantial protein and fat. This one fish represents maybe 2 days of survival, 2 days of precious calories to help maintain body temperature. Dmitri rebaits and drops his line again. Yulia is still working her whole, rhythmic jigging motions, patient as stone. Alexei and you take turns feeding the fire, which has burned down significantly. You're running through the carried wood faster than hoped. 20 minutes pass. 30. The sun is definitely lower now, and the temperature is beginning to drop again as the day's minimal warmth bleeds away. You check your extremities and discover your left foot is numb again. More seriously this time. You mention it to Dmitri, and he examines your boot with concern. What he discovers is bad. Ice is formed inside your boot from accumulated condensation. Moisture from your foot meeting the extreme cold outside has created a layer of frost between your skin and the insulation. Your foot is essentially sitting in an ice bath. Dmitri makes a decision. He gestures for you to sit by the fire, removes your boot completely, and begins unwrapping the hide layers. Your foot is pale, waxy-looking, several toes white instead of pink. This is frostbite, progressing from superficial to serious. Svetlana had taught a rewarming technique, and Dmitri applies it now. He opens his own coat, places your bare foot against his stomach, direct skin contact with his body heat. It's shockingly intimate and absolutely necessary. The warmth is agonizing. As circulation returns, the pain is intense enough that you have to bite down on the wooden toggle to keep from crying out. Don't rub it, Yulia warns. That's old wrong advice. Rubbing frostbitten tissue causes damage. Just gradual rewarming with body heat. While Dmitri works on your foot, Yulia gets a strike on her line. She pulls up another whitefish, smaller than the first but still valuable. 2 fish now. The odds are improving. Alexei has been quiet, staring at the horizon. Now he speaks. We need to make a decision. This may be 3 hours back to the station, and the sun sets in less than 2 hours. If we stay to fish longer, we're walking back in the dark in dropping temperatures. He's right, and everyone knows it. The question is whether 2 fish is enough to justify the risk and effort, or whether you push for more. Dmitri finishes with your foot. It's painful but alive, no permanent damage if you're careful, and helps you get the boot back on with fresh, dry hide wrappings. Then he speaks at length and Yulia translates. He says in traditional fishing, you never take more than you need. Not for spiritual reasons, though those matter too, but for practical ones. The more you carry, the slower you move. The slower you move in extreme cold, the longer exposure, the more danger. 2 fish is good. 2 fish is enough. We thank the lake, we thank the fish, and we go home. It's wisdom you can't argue with, though the modern part of your brain, the part that thinks in terms of surplus and insurance, wants to push for one more, just one more. But Dmitri is already packing up the fishing gear, carefully coiling the sinew line, wrapping the bone hooks, preparing for departure. Yulia and Alexei begin the process of extinguishing the fire, not smothering it, which would waste the half-burned wood, but carefully disassembling it, saving the larger pieces to carry back to the station. The fish get wrapped in hide and distributed. Dmitri carries one, Alexei the other. The weight is minimal, but in your exhausted state, every gram matters. Before leaving, Dmitri performs the same kind of ritual Svetlana did at the station. He takes a piece of fish, drops it through the ice hole back into the water, and speaks words in Yakut. An offering to the lake, thanks for the catch, a request for safe passage home. Then you begin the walk back. The return journey is harder than the outbound trip. You're all exhausted now, running on fumes, your caloric reserves depleted, your core temperatures lower than when you started. The sun is setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple and deep blue, beautiful and merciless. You focus on walking, just walking, 1 foot in front of the other, maintaining the rhythm, breathing carefully, checking extremities during the scheduled stops. Your left foot is a constant source of anxiety. You can feel it, but just barely, and you know you're dancing on the edge of serious frostbite. The landscape takes on an otherworldly quality in the fading light. The taiga forest looks like something from a dream, each tree perfectly still, branches heavy with frost. The aurora is beginning to appear again, faint green ribbons in the darkening sky. Halfway back, Yulia stumbles. Not a dramatic fall, just a momentary loss of coordination. But in these conditions, it's alarming. Alexei catches her elbow, keeps her upright. She mumbles something about being fine, but her speech is slightly slurred, early hypothermia affecting cognitive function. Dmitri makes the call. Extended break. You all huddle together, sharing body heat, and Dmitri distributes small pieces of the carried fish. Raw, frozen, but edible and desperately needed. The fat and protein hit your system like fuel in an engine, providing a surge of energy. After 10 minutes, Yulia is more coherent. Sorry, she says. Got dizzy. I'm okay now. But she's not okay, not really. None of you are. You're all operating at the edge of your physiological limits, held together by determination and the knowledge that the research station and Svetlana and the fire are waiting. The final hour of walking is a test of will. Full darkness has fallen. The stars are impossible, millions of them, the Milky Way a river of light across the sky. The aurora dances more vigorously now, as if celebrating or mourning, you can't tell which. And then, finally, gloriously, lights. The research station appears on the horizon, its small windows glowing with firelight. Svetlana has kept the fire burning, kept the shelter warm, kept the faith. The final 100 meters take forever. Your body wants to rush, to sprint toward safety, but Dmitri maintains the steady pace because rushing means sweating means death, even this close to safety. The outer door, the Arctic entry, the blessed warmth of the inner room where Svetlana waits, and the fire crackles and safety. Temporary, conditional safety, but safety nonetheless. Wraps around you like a blanket. Svetlana takes one look at everyone and immediately begins triage. She gets Yulia closest to the fire, examines her pupils for signs of serious hypothermia. She inspects everyone's extremities with clinical efficiency. Your left foot gets special attention. She unwraps it, studies the toes, nods grimly, and begins a gentle massage technique. The fish get placed near, but not too near, the fire to thaw slowly. 2 substantial whitefish representing maybe 4 pounds of fish meat. Not a feast, but enough to extend survival by crucial days. Dmitri collapses near the stove, utterly spent. Alexei is shaking uncontrollably, delayed stress response, his body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the danger. You're somewhere between exhaustion and euphoria, unable to quite process that you walked 14 kilometers in -73-degree weather and survived. Svetlana prepares tea, and this time she adds tiny pieces of fish fat to the water. The oil provides calories and helps with hydration. The tea is greasy, slightly fishy, and absolutely glorious. Outside, the temperature has dropped to -77 degrees. But inside, fed and warming, the fire burning steadily, you've bought yourself time. Not much time, not guaranteed safety, but time, which in a Yakutian winter is the most precious currency of all. The aftermath of the fishing expedition reveals itself slowly, the way damage from extreme cold always does. Not in the moment, but in the hours that follow when your body finally has enough warmth and safety to start accounting for what it's lost. You're all arranged around the stove like survivors of a shipwreck, gradually taking inventory of injuries and assessing what the 14-kilometer round trip has cost. Your left foot is the most concerning. Even after Svetlana's massage and careful rewarming, 3 of your toes remain pale and waxy, lacking the healthy pink of restored circulation. Svetlana examines them with the clinical detachment of someone who's seen this 1,000 times, pressing gently on the tissue, watching how it responds. She speaks to Dmitri in Yakut, and he nods gravely. Yulia, recovered enough to translate, delivers the verdict. 2nd-degree frostbite, possibly approaching 3rd. The tissue is damaged but probably salvageable if we're careful. You need to keep that foot warm constantly, never let it get cold again. If the tissue turns black or develops blisters, then we're looking at potential amputation, but we're not there yet. The word amputation lands in the room like a stone in still water. Nobody says anything, but everyone's doing the same calculation. If medical evacuation doesn't come soon, if infection sets in, if the damage progresses, someone in this room might be making decisions about surgical intervention with nothing but a bone knife and whatever antibiotics might be scavenged from the station's meager medical supplies. Alexei has frostbite on his nose and left ear, less serious than your foot, but still concerning. The affected skin is hard and white, and Svetlana treats it with the same careful rewarming technique, using warm, not hot, water and gentle pressure. As circulation returns, Alexei hisses in pain, tears forming in his eyes not from emotion but from the sheer agony of frozen tissue coming back to life. Yulia escaped the worst of the frostbite, but her hypothermia scare on the return trip has left her shaky and exhausted. Her core temperature dropped low enough to affect her cognitive function, which means she was closer to serious danger than anyone realized at the time. Svetlana makes her drink warm fish fat tea and wraps her in every available hide, essentially creating a human burrito by the fire. Dmitri, remarkably, seems largely unscathed. 60-plus years of Yakutian winters have taught his body how to manage extreme cold in ways the rest of you simply don't possess. Or maybe he's just better at hiding damage. Svetlana examines him anyway, checking his fingers and toes, making him breathe deeply so she can listen for signs of frozen lung tissue. While the medical assessments continue, you notice the wood pile. The expedition consumed more fuel than anyone wanted to admit, The fire was kept burning all day both here at the station and at the fishing site. What remains might last another 24 hours, maybe 36 with strict rationing. The fish, meanwhile, have thawed enough to begin processing. Svetlana demonstrates traditional sake preparation. She fillets the fish with swift, practiced cuts, separating meat from bone with minimal waste. The bones and heads go into a pot for broth. In extreme cold, you waste nothing because every calorie matters. The fillets get cut into portions, some for immediate consumption, some to be dried near the fire for preservation. The smell of fish broth beginning to simmer is intoxicating. Your body, depleted and desperate, responds to the aroma with almost painful hunger. Svetlana rations it carefully. Small portions now to restore immediate energy, with the bulk saved for the coming days. The first taste of hot fish broth is a religious experience. The fat coats your mouth. The protein hits your depleted muscles. The warmth spreads through your core. For just a moment, sitting here with hot food and fire, you can almost forget you're trapped in a Soviet research station in the coldest inhabited place on Earth with rescue still uncertain. But only almost. Yulia has retrieved the broken satellite phone and is examining it by firelight, more for something to do than from any real hope of repair. "You know what's ironic?" she says. "The Soviets built these research stations all over Yakutia in the 1960s and 70s. Part of the great push to conquer and scientifically document every corner of the USSR. They spent millions of rubles on infrastructure, equipment, personnel. And then the Union collapsed and suddenly all these stations were orphaned, left to decay with minimal maintenance." She turns the useless phone over in her hands. Historians still argue whether the Soviet scientific program in places like this was genuine research or just territorial posturing, planting flags and saying, "This is ours." Probably both. But either way, what remains is these weird monuments to imperial ambition, slowly falling apart in the permafrost. "That's a depressing thought," Alexei mutters. "Accurate though," Yulia replies. "We're literally sheltering in the ruins of an empire that collapsed before some of us were born, using its leftover fuel to not freeze to death. There's a metaphor in there somewhere." Dmitri, who lived through the Soviet era and its collapse, makes a dismissive sound and says something sharp in Yakut. Yulia grins and translates. He says empires come and go but the land remains, and the Saka people were here before the Soviets and will be here after. The taiga doesn't care about political systems. The broth gets distributed in the chipped enamel cups that have become your most valued possessions. You sip it slowly, savoring every drop, and feel strength returning to your limbs. The fish meat is firm and slightly oily, with a clean flavor that speaks of cold, pure water. Even in these circumstances, it's genuinely good. Svetlana is watching everyone eat with the satisfaction of a grandmother seeing her family fed. She speaks and Yulia translates. She says in the old days, after a successful hunt or fishing expedition, the Saka people would have a small celebration. Not a feast. You never feast when food is scarce, but a moment of gratitude and shared joy. She thinks we should honor that tradition. It seems absurd on the surface. Celebrating while trapped, injured, and running out of fuel. But the deeper wisdom is clear. Morale matters. Hope matters. The psychological act of acknowledging success, even small success, helps maintain the will to survive. So you celebrate in your own strange way. Dmitri produces a small wooden flute from his pack. You had no idea he was carrying it, and plays a melody that sounds like wind across empty steppes, like the call of migratory birds, like 10,000 years of human persistence in impossible places. The music is haunting and beautiful, and for the duration of the song, you're not trapped survivors but participants in something ancient and larger than yourselves. When the music ends, there's silence broken only by the fire and the building's occasional groans as metal contracts in the deepening cold. The thermometer outside reads -78 degrees Celsius. You've stopped being shocked by the numbers. Alexei breaks the silence. "We need to talk about tomorrow, the fuel situation, what we do if rescue doesn't come." He's right. The fish has bought time, but it hasn't solved the fundamental problem. You're still trapped, still isolated, still dependent on a fire that's consuming wood faster than you can conserve it. Dmitri speaks and Yulia translates. He says tomorrow we need to make a serious decision about the village. The fishing succeeded, which proves we can travel in these conditions if we're careful. 7 kilometers to Oymyakon is survivable if we go slow, take breaks, support each other. But we can't all go, some people are too injured or too weak. So we'd need to split up. The strongest walk to the village, bring back help, sleds, supplies. Who would stay? You ask, though you already know the answer. The injured, the elderly, Yulia says bluntly, meaning you with your foot. Svetlana, obviously. Probably me after my hypothermia scare today. That leaves Dmitri and Alexei as the strongest candidates to make the walk. Alexei nods slowly. I don't love the idea of splitting up. Everything I know about survival says you stay together. But everything I know about our current situation says we're going to run out of fuel before rescue comes. If 2 of us can reach the village, we can organize proper evacuation. Snowmobiles, maybe even a working vehicle if the roads are passable. And if you don't make it? You ask quietly. Alexei doesn't flinch from the question. Then at least you 3 still have the fire and the fish and a chance. Better than all 5 of us sitting here watching the wood pile disappear. This brutal calculus, but it makes a certain terrible sense. The question is timing. Do you send Dmitri and Alexei tomorrow, giving them the best chance but leaving the rest of you potentially without help if they fail? Or do you wait another day, conserve fuel, hope that rescue might materialize? Svetlana has been listening carefully, and now she speaks with the authority of someone who's lived through more winters and more crises than all of you combined. Yulia translates. She says we're thinking about this wrong. We're thinking like modern people. Make a plan, execute the plan, hope for success. But the Saka way is different. You don't plan for one outcome. You plan for many. You prepare for success and failure simultaneously. You create what she calls layered survival. Svetlana stands and begins moving around the room, gathering items and explaining as she goes. Through Yulia's translation, the strategy becomes clear. Layer 1. Dmitri and Alexei prepare to leave for the village tomorrow at first light. They carry minimal gear, move fast, aim to reach Oymyakon by early afternoon. If successful, they return with help by evening or next morning. Layer 2. You, Yulia, and Svetlana remain at the station with strict fuel rationing. The fire gets reduced to absolute minimum, just enough to prevent the room from reaching equilibrium with outside temperature. You wear every available layer, huddle together for shared warmth, and extend the fuel to potentially 48 hours. Layer 3. If Dmitri and Alexei don't return within 36 hours, you assume something went wrong. At that point, the remaining fuel is used to prepare for your own evacuation attempt, or you burn the furniture, flooring, anything combustible to extend survival further. Layer 4. Emergency cache. Svetlana reveals that she's been secretly setting aside small amounts of everything. Fish, tea, tinder, a few pieces of wood, hidden in various corners of the room. If everything else fails, these emergency reserves provide one last chance. It's brilliant in its comprehensiveness, creating multiple fallback positions rather than betting everything on one outcome. This is the accumulated wisdom of a culture that survived 10 millennia by never assuming the best-case scenario. We implement this tomorrow, Dmitri agrees. Tonight we rest. We recover. We tend our injuries and restore our strength. Tomorrow we split up, and we trust that the land and the cold and whatever spirits watch over fools in Yakutia will show us mercy. The night watch rotation gets organized. Everyone is too injured or exhausted for solo shifts, so it's decided you'll work in pairs. 2 people awake at all times, monitoring the fire, checking on the sleepers, maintaining vigilance. First watch is you and Svetlana. The others arrange themselves as close to the fire as possible, wrapped in hides, and quickly fall into the exhausted sleep of people who've pushed their bodies to absolute limits. Svetlana tends the fire with minimal fuel, keeping it alive but small. You watch her work, admiring the economy of her movements, the way she can assess exactly how much wood to add to maintain temperature without waste. She notices your attention and smiles. Then she begins speaking in Yakut, slowly, as if she knows you won't understand the words but might grasp the meaning. Her voice is rhythmic, almost melodic. She's telling a story. You don't interrupt, don't ask for translation. Some stories don't need words to communicate. You hear in her tone the rises and falls of narrative, moments of tension and release, sections that sound like they might be dialogue, passages that have the quality of description or reflection. When she finishes, she looks at you expectantly. You respond the only way you can. That was beautiful, even though I didn't understand. She seems satisfied with that answer and returns to the fire. You sit together in comfortable silence. Two people from completely different worlds, bound together by cold and fire and the simple imperative to survive until dawn. The fire crackles. Outside, the aurora dances across the sky in waves of green and violet. Your damaged toes throb with dull pain. The temperature outside has reached -79 degrees Celsius, possibly the coldest you'll experience in your entire life. But inside, for this moment, there's warmth and companionship and the knowledge that you've survived another day in conditions that should have killed you. Tomorrow brings new challenges, new dangers, new decisions. But tonight, you tend the fire and watch the old woman work and feel, against all logic, something approaching peace. The hours pass. Yulia and Alexei take the next watch. Then Dmitri alone, insisting he doesn't need a partner. Then back to you and Svetlana for the pre-dawn shift, where the fire is lowest and the cold presses closest and survival feels most uncertain. The sun begins its reluctant rise, painting the frozen world in shades of gray and blue and gold. Day 3 of your ordeal begins with a decision point. Stay together or split up, conserve or risk, hope for rescue or create your own salvation. Dmitri stands at the window, watching the sunrise, and speaks a single word in Yakut that Yulia, just waking, translates automatically. Today, today. The word carries weight, promise and threat, possibility and danger, all compressed into a single syllable. Today you'll discover if Svetlana's layered survival strategy is wisdom or desperation, if Dmitri and Alexei can reach the village, if your frostbitten toes will heal or blacken, if the fire will last or fail, if rescue will come, or if you'll be adding your own story to the long history of people who gambled against Yakutian winter and lost. Today, the preparation for separation happens in that strange pre-dawn gray where the world hasn't quite committed to being day or night. Dmitri and Alexei are stripping down their gear to absolute essentials. Every gram of unnecessary weight is a liability on a 7-kilometer forced march in -79-degree cold. They'll carry water, a small amount of fish and dried berries, the tinder kit, a single hide for emergency shelter, and nothing else. Speed and efficiency are their only advantages now. Svetlana prepares their food rations with the solemnity of someone sending soldiers to war. She wraps the portions in reindeer intestine to keep moisture from freezing them solid, then tucks them into inner pockets where body heat will keep them accessible. She checks every piece of their clothing, examining seams and closures, adding extra hide strips where she identifies weak points. You watch this preparation while dealing with your own crisis, your left foot. The 3 frostbitten toes have darkened overnight from waxy white to a disturbing gray-purple. There's no pain exactly, just a deep, bone-level ache and the terrifying absence of normal sensation. When you try to wiggle them, the response is delayed, sluggish, like the neural pathways are degrading. Yulia examines the toes with her geologist's analytical eye, someone used to assessing damage in mineral samples. The tissue isn't black yet, she says carefully. That's good. Black means necrosis, dead tissue, amputation mandatory. Purple-gray means severely damaged but potentially salvageable. You need to keep this foot religiously warm and elevated. Any more cold exposure and you'll lose these toes for certain. She doesn't add if you're lucky, but it hangs unspoken in the air. Lose the toes if you're lucky, lose the foot if you're not, lose your life if infection sets in. Svetlana has prepared a special poultice using dried herbs from her seemingly infinite supply of traditional remedies. She applies it to the damaged toes. It smells of pine and something sharper, medicinal, and wraps the foot in fresh hide. The herb knowledge is fascinating. These are species that grow in the brief Yakutian summer, plants that evolve to pack entire life cycles into a few months of warmth, creating concentrated compounds to survive their own extreme conditions. In Soviet times, Yulia says quietly while Svetlana works, There were efforts to catalog traditional Saka medicine, document which plants were used for what conditions. Some researchers approached it respectfully, genuinely wanting to preserve knowledge. Others were basically engaged in biopiracy, trying to extract commercially valuable compounds without crediting or compensating the indigenous knowledge holders. She lights one of her dwindling cigarettes. Historians still argue whether that research did more harm than good. On one hand, some traditional knowledge got preserved that might otherwise have been lost. On the other hand, the power dynamic was completely colonial, Russian scientists extracting value from Saka culture without giving back. And now climate change is shifting the taiga ecosystem so fast that some of the traditional medicine plants are disappearing. Species that survived 10,000 years of natural climate variation might not survive the next 50 years of anthropogenic change. It's a depressing thought, made more so by your current total dependence on exactly that traditional knowledge for survival. Without Svetlana's herb poultice, your toes would almost certainly progress to full necrosis. Without Dmitri's ice fishing expertise, you'd have no food. Without the accumulated wisdom of countless generations learning to live with extreme cold, you'd all be dead already. Dmitri and Alexei are nearly ready. Dmitri calls everyone together for what feels like a final briefing, speaking in a mixture of Yakut and Russian that Yulia translates. We leave when there's enough light to navigate safely. 7 kilometers to the village. 3 to 4 hours if conditions are good. We'll follow the landmarks. The rock formation that looks like a sleeping bear, the 3-tree cluster, the old Soviet survey marker. If we're not back by full darkness tonight, roughly 16 hours from now, assume something went wrong. Don't wait for us. Use the remaining fuel to stay alive as long as possible. What could go wrong? You ask, though you immediately regret the question because the possible answers are too numerous and terrible. Alexei answers anyway. Cold could get worse. We could get disoriented despite the landmarks. One of us could fall through thin ice we didn't expect. The village might not have the resources or personnel to mount an immediate rescue. Hundreds of things could go wrong. But hundreds of things have already gone wrong, and we're still here, so... He leaves the sentence unfinished, and somehow that's more powerful than any platitude about hope or determination. Svetlana performs the departure ritual. She takes hot coals from the fire and places them in a small metal container that Dmitri will carry. The coals won't stay hot for the entire journey, but they'll retain warmth for hours, providing a heat source for emergency fire starting if needed. She speaks a blessing in Yakut or a prayer or maybe just practical advice. You can't tell the difference and maybe there isn't one. Then she does something unexpected. She removes a small carved pendant from around her neck, a piece of amber containing what looks like a preserved insect, and places it around Dmitri's neck. He protests, clearly understanding the significance of the gesture, but Svetlana is firm. Yulia translates. She says it belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. For generations of Saka women have worn it. It's protected them through wars, famines, purges, and countless winters. Now it will protect him. Dmitri touches the amber with reverence, then embraces Svetlana. A quick, fierce hug that communicates more than words could. Then he and Alexei move to the door. The final moment before separation stretches impossibly long. You want to say something meaningful, some words of encouragement or wisdom, but everything that comes to mind sounds hollow or trite. Finally, you settle for, walk carefully. We'll keep the fire burning. Alexei nods. See you tonight, or tomorrow, or whenever we get back with half the village and a working heater. And then they're through the outer door into the Arctic entry and gone. Through the window, you watch them become small figures against the vast white landscape, moving with the careful, measured pace that extreme cold demands. Within 20 minutes, they've disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the taiga and the cold. The research station feels enormous and empty with just 3 of you remaining. Svetlana immediately implements the strict fuel rationing plan. The fire gets reduced to a small core of coals, barely putting out heat, just enough to keep combustion alive. The temperature inside the room begins dropping almost immediately. You, Yulia, and Svetlana arrange yourselves in a tight cluster near the stove, sharing body heat, wrapped in every available hide. This is survival at its most basic. 3 mammals huddled together against the cold, using the same strategy that wolves and Arctic foxes and countless other species use to endure. The first hour is bearable. The second hour is uncomfortable. By the third hour, you're genuinely cold despite all the layers, despite the proximity to the fire, despite being indoors. Your breath fogs the air. The frost patterns on the inside of the windows grow more elaborate, climbing higher up the glass. Yulia checks the thermometer. Minus 81 degrees Celsius outside. The temperature is still dropping. Inside, it's maybe minus 20, minus 25, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, but not instantly lethal. Not yet. To pass the time and keep minds active, cognitive function declines in the cold, and you need to fight that. Yulia starts telling stories from her geological survey work. She describes finding fossilized remains of Pleistocene megafauna perfectly preserved in the permafrost. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions that died 30,000 years ago and look like they could wake up at any moment. The permafrost is the world's largest natural freezer, she says, her breath creating small clouds. It preserves everything: animal remains, plant matter, ancient bacteria, and viruses. There's even preserved DNA viable enough to potentially clone extinct species. Some scientists argue we have an ethical obligation to resurrect these animals, recreate lost ecosystems. Others argue that's playing God and we should let the dead stay dead. What do you think? You ask. Yulia considers. I think nature doesn't care about our ethics. The permafrost is melting because of climate change. All those preserved organisms are being exposed whether we like it or not. Ancient microbes are waking up after millennia frozen. Some might be harmless. Some might be pathogens humans have no immunity to. We didn't ask for this, but we created the conditions for it. It's an unsettling thought. Invisible threats thawing out of the frozen earth, adding another layer of danger to an already hostile environment. But it's also somehow fitting. Everything about Yakutia feels ancient and dangerous and indifferent to human concerns. Svetlana has been quiet, conserving energy, but now she stirs and begins speaking. Her story, translated in fragments by Yulia, is about the time she was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, traveling with her family's reindeer herd during an unexpected cold snap in early winter. The temperature dropped to minus 60, maybe minus 65. She's not sure because they had no thermometers, just experience and the behavior of the animals to gauge the danger. One of the reindeer, a pregnant female, went into labor during the worst of the cold. Normal protocol would be to help the birth along quickly, get the calf dry and warm, but this labor was difficult, complicated. Svetlana and her mother worked through the night in conditions that should have killed them and definitely killed the calf. It was born alive but couldn't survive the cold despite their best efforts. The mother reindeer survived, though she grieved for days, calling for her lost calf, refusing to eat. Why tell us this story? You ask gently. It's heartbreaking. Svetlana responds, and Yulia translates. Because survival isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about enduring loss and continuing anyway. The mother reindeer grieved, but she didn't lie down and die. She eventually rejoined the herd, and the next year she had a healthy calf. The land teaches this lesson over and over. Loss is inevitable, grief is natural, but surrender is a choice. The story sits heavy in the cold air. You think about your frostbitten toes, about Dmitry and Alexei walking through minus 81-degree cold toward uncertain rescue, about all the ways this situation could end badly. But you also think about the fact that you're still here, still breathing, still fighting, still choosing not to surrender. The fire needs the smallest possible feeding to stay alive. Svetlana adds a single piece of wood, barely larger than kindling, and the coals brighten slightly. The wood pile is diminishing at a rate that's terrifying when you calculate how many hours remain until Dmitry and Alexei return, if they return. To distract yourself from that calculation, you ask Yulia about the Soviet gulags she mentioned earlier. She's reluctant at first. It's dark history, uncomfortable, but eventually she talks. Dalstroy, she says, the Far North Construction Trust, officially a construction and mining organization. actually a vast slave labor system that operated throughout Yakutia and the wider Russian Far East from the 1930s through the 1950s. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, political dissidents, intellectuals, ethnic minorities, anyone Stalin wanted disappeared, sent to mine gold and tin and build infrastructure in places where the cold did half the killing for the guards. She shifts position, trying to get comfortable on the hard floor. I've surveyed dozens of former campsites. You can still find artifacts, rusted tools, collapsed barracks, mass graves. Some sites have been partially excavated by historians and forensic anthropologists, trying to document what happened, identify victims. But it's slow work and controversial. Some people want the truth exposed. Others want to let the past stay buried. What's your position? You ask. I'm a scientist, not a politician, but I think truth matters. These weren't abstract political prisoners, they were real people with names and families and stories, and they died in places like this, often for nothing more than telling a joke about Stalin or belonging to the wrong ethnic group. Documenting that, bearing witness to it, feels important, even if it's painful. Maybe especially because it's painful. Svetlana adds something in Yakut, her voice sad. Yulia translates. She says her own uncle was sent to a Dalstroy camp in 1951. The official charge was anti-Soviet agitation, but his real crime was being an educated Saka man who spoke out about forced collectivization and the destruction of traditional lifeways. He died in the camp within a year. The family didn't even learn he was dead for another 3 years. No grave, no body, just gone. The weight of that history, personal, national, human, settles over your small group. You're huddled in a Soviet building, using Soviet-era equipment, sheltering from the same cold that killed countless Gulag prisoners. The ghosts feel very close. Hours pass. You drift in and out of a cold-induced stupor that's not quite sleep but not quite wakefulness either. Every muscle aches from the constant shivering. Your frostbitten foot throbs with a deep, sickening pain that painkillers, even if you had any, probably couldn't touch. Yulia checks her watch periodically, tracking time until Dmitri and Alexei's expected return. 8 hours since they left. 10 hours. 12 hours. The sun has completed its brief arc across the sky and is now setting, painting the snow in those same unreal colors. Orange, purple, deep blue. By hour 14, anxiety is settling in like the cold. They should be back by now if everything went well. The delay could mean many things. They're bringing more people and equipment, slowing their return. The village needed time to organize a rescue party, or something went wrong. At hour 16, full darkness, minus 83 degrees outside, Svetlana makes the decision to slightly increase the fire. Not because you can afford to waste fuel, but because morale is as important as calories, and the three of you need warmth and light to fight off the despair that comes with waiting and not knowing. The fire brightens. Heat increases marginally. You gather closer, and Svetlana prepares the last of the fish broth, splitting it 3 ways, a small comfort in the long night. They're fine, Yulia says, though her voice carries doubt. They just got delayed. They'll be here by morning with help. Of course. You agree because what else can you say? Svetlana speaks in Yakut, her voice firm, almost defiant. Yulia translates. She says worry is useless emotion. Either they return or they don't. Either rescue comes or it doesn't. What we control is here, now, keeping the fire alive, keeping ourselves alive, maintaining the faith that we deserve to survive. The cold respects strength, not worry. She's right, but knowing she's right doesn't make the waiting any easier. Night deepens. The aurora appears again, more spectacular than ever, sheets of green and red and violet cascading across the sky like divine curtains. You watch through the window, transfixed despite your exhaustion and fear, because even now, maybe especially now, beauty matters. Somewhere out there in that frozen darkness, 2 men are either bringing salvation or have become 2 more casualties of the Yakutian winter. Somewhere, the thermometer continues its relentless fall. Somewhere, your frostbitten toes are making their own decisions about survival. But here, now, there's fire and companionship and the stubborn human refusal to accept defeat. You feed the fire its meager ration. You check your extremities. You share warmth and wait. Wait for dawn. Wait for rescue. Wait to learn if your gamble has paid off or if the cold has won after all. The science of why some people survive freezing when they shouldn't is a strange intersection of physiology, luck, and phenomena that medical researchers still don't fully understand. Yulia, keeping herself awake during the long night watch, talks about this while you and Svetlana huddle close to the diminished fire, burning the last of your reliable fuel. There are documented cases, she says, her voice hoarse from the cold and dehydration, of people who've survived core body temperatures that should be incompatible with life. There's a Swedish woman who fell through ice, was submerged for 80 minutes, and her body temperature dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius. 13.7. That's barely above refrigerator temperature. Clinically, definitively dead by any normal measure. But they warmed her slowly, carefully, and she survived with full cognitive function. You're barely listening, focused mostly on the alarming numbness spreading from your damaged toes up through your foot. But some part of your brain registers the information. 13.7 degrees. You wonder what your own core temperature is now, whether you're approaching those impossible numbers. The mechanism is called metabolic iceboxing. Yulia continues, partly for information and partly to keep her own mind active. Extreme cold essentially puts your body into suspended animation. Your metabolism slows to almost nothing, your cells require minimal oxygen, and if rewarming is done correctly, and that's crucial, it has to be done correctly, the tissues can sometimes recover without permanent damage. Sometimes, you murmur, great odds. Better than zero, Yulia counters. That Swedish woman? The rescue team almost gave up on her. The doctor who insisted on continuing resuscitation later said he'd violated protocols, risked his medical license because he had a feeling. Not science, not data, a feeling. And he was right. Historians still argue whether that case should inform medical protocols or if it was a statistical anomaly that shouldn't change standard practice. Svetlana has been silent for hours, conserving energy, but now she speaks. Yulia translates. She says modern medicine thinks of the body like a machine. When it breaks past certain points, it's dead. But traditional Saka understanding is different. The body has a kind of knowing, a wisdom deeper than thought. Sometimes people survive impossible cold because their body decides to survive, makes adjustments that science can't measure or predict. She's seen it herself. People who should have frozen, who by all logic should be dead, but who wake up days later like nothing happened. And the ones who don't wake up? You ask. Svetlana shrugs philosophically. Yulia translates. Their bodies decided differently, or the spirits decided, or luck ran out. You can't always know why survival happens or doesn't happen. That uncertainty is part of living in a place like this. The fire is dying. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of entropy. You're down to a handful of wood pieces, maybe enough for another 6 hours if you ration with absolute discipline. After that, you're looking at burning furniture, the wooden table first, then perhaps pieces of the floorboards, then anything else combustible. Your watch says it's 3:47 a.m. Dmitri and Alexei left almost 20 hours ago. The math is unavoidable. Something has gone wrong. Either they didn't reach the village, or they reached it but couldn't organize immediate rescue, or they reached it and are coming but delayed by the extreme cold that's now hit minus 85 degrees Celsius outside.
Minus 85.
You've stopped being shocked by the numbers because shock requires emotional energy you don't have. It's just data now, abstract and terrible. Svetlana makes the decision to break into her emergency cache. From various hiding spots around the room, she retrieves the items she'd secretly squirreled away. Small portions of dried fish, a few pieces of precious wood, a leather pouch of tea leaves. She'd prepared for the possibility that the others wouldn't return, that the three of you would need to survive on your own for potentially days longer. We eat now, Yulia translates. Build our strength. Because when dawn comes, we may need to make our own attempt to reach the village. The thought of walking 7 kilometers in minus 85-degree cold with a severely frostbitten foot is horrifying. But so is sitting here waiting to freeze as the fire dies. You're entering the phase of crisis where all options are terrible and you're just choosing between different flavors of potential death. Svetlana prepares the emergency rations with her usual care. The fish gets warmed slightly near the coals, making it easier to chew and digest. The tea is rationed into 3 small cups, more symbolic than sustaining, but the ritual matters. Maintaining human habits, human dignity, helps fight the slow surrender to cold and despair. While you eat, Yulia talks about another case study, this one from Antarctica. A research team got stranded when their vehicle broke down, spent 3 days in an emergency shelter in -60-degree cold with minimal supplies. They survived by doing exactly what you're doing now. Huddling together, strict rationing, maintaining morale through conversation and routine. The medical analysis afterward was fascinating, she says. All of them showed signs of frostbite and mild hypothermia, but the psychological assessment was more interesting. They reported that the hardest part wasn't the physical suffering, it was the uncertainty. Not knowing if rescue was coming, not knowing if their decisions were right or wrong, not knowing if they'd live or die. That uncertainty was more psychologically damaging than the cold itself. That's extremely comforting right now, you mutter. Actually, it is, Yulia insists, because they did survive. Despite the uncertainty, despite the cold, despite making decisions with incomplete information, they survived. And so can we. Svetlana adds something in Yakut, her voice carrying an edge of steel. Yulia translates. She says humans are tougher than we believe. Modern soft living makes us forget what the body can endure. Our ancestors survived ice ages, migrations across frozen continents, winters without end. That capacity doesn't disappear in a few generations of central heating. It's still there, in our cells, in our bones. We just have to remember it. The fire needs attention. You add one of the emergency wood pieces, watching it catch and flare. The heat increase is noticeable, almost luxurious, and you understand why fire worship was humanity's first religion. When fire is all that stands between you and death, it's easy to see it as divine. Your foot has progressed beyond pain into a disturbing numbness. When you unwrap it to check, Svetlana insists on hourly inspections. The 3 damaged toes are definitely darker. Not black yet, but a deep purple-gray that speaks of tissue in serious distress. The skin is tight, almost shiny, and when you press gently there's no blanching, no color change, which means blood flow is severely compromised. Svetlana examines it with her practiced eye and delivers her assessment through Yulia. The toes are dying. Maybe they can be saved with proper medical care, warming chambers, hyperbaric oxygen, things we don't have here. More likely, you'll lose them, but that's future problem. Right now, we focus on keeping you alive, so there is a future to worry about lost toes. It's pragmatic to the point of brutal, but also oddly comforting. Yes, you'll probably lose 3 toes, but you're being told this by a woman who's survived 7 decades of Yakutian winters, and if she thinks toe loss is an acceptable price for overall survival, you'll take that trade. Dawn arrives with agonizing slowness, the sky transitioning from black to gray with the enthusiasm of a student on Monday morning. The temperature outside has stabilized at -85, which is almost good news. At least it stopped falling. Inside, it's perhaps -30, cold enough that water would freeze instantly, cold enough that exposed skin would be damaged in under a minute, but not instantly lethal. With dawn comes decision time. The fuel is essentially gone, maybe 3 hours of minimal fire remaining. Dmitry and Alexei have been gone over 24 hours. Rescue hasn't arrived. The options have narrowed to 2. Attempt the walk to the village yourself or start burning the furniture and building structure, buying perhaps another full day of shelter. Svetlana, Yulia, and you hold a quiet council. Each person speaks their position, Saka style, listening without interruption. Yulia goes first. My professional training says we wait. Burning the furniture buys time, and time is what we need. Rescue could arrive at any moment. We don't know what's happening in the village, what complications Dmitry and Alexei encountered. Walking out in our current condition, especially with your foot, is extremely high risk. You go next. I'm a liability on a walk. We all know it. But I'm also a liability here because you'd need to support me if we stay, ration food and fuel toward keeping me alive. Maybe the calculation is that you 2 walk out, leave me here with the remaining supplies, Maximize your chances while I maximize the time alone. That's logical. Svetlana makes a sharp sound and speaks firmly. Yulia translates. She says she won't hear talk of abandoning anyone. The Saka don't leave their people. If we walk together, slow as necessary. If we stay together. We succeed together or fail together. That's not negotiable. The steel in her voice makes it clear this isn't up for debate. You're genuinely moved and also slightly terrified because it means you can't make the noble sacrifice play if things get worse. Before the discussion can continue, Yulia holds up her hand. Wait, listen. You strain your ears against the silence. First, nothing. Then, faintly, impossibly, the sound of an engine. Not the biological sounds of wind or wolves, but the mechanical growl of a motor pushing through extreme cold. All three of you scramble to the window while Yulia and Svetlana scramble. You hobble frantically and stare out at the frozen landscape. There, in the distance, moving slowly but definitely moving, lights. Multiple lights. The wavering beams of headlights approaching through the dawn. Rescue. Actual, real, impossible rescue. The vehicles, plural, you can see now there are three of them, approach with agonizing slowness. They're Ural trucks, the same model Alexei had been driving, Soviet-era beasts designed for exactly these conditions, though even they're struggling, moving at perhaps 10 kilometers per hour through the deep snow and extreme cold. Yulia is crying, though whether from relief or emotion or just cold-induced tear duct malfunction, you can't tell. Svetlana is speaking rapidly in Yakut, and you catch the word, spasibo. Thank you. Repeated over and over. The trucks arrive. Doors open. People emerge, so bundled in cold weather gear they look like aliens, and among them, Dmitri and Alexei alive, moving stiffly but alive. What follows is a chaos of rescue. Someone, a medical technician from Oymyakon, examines your foot with professional efficiency and immediately begins preparing you for transport. Your toes are packed in sterile dressing, your foot elevated, your core temperature checked with instruments that confirm what you suspected. You're hypothermic, not severely but enough to impair judgment and motor control. Alexei appears at your side, his face showing significant frostbite damage on his nose and cheeks. But he's grinning. We made it. Took forever, the cold was worse than expected, and we had to take shelter twice. The village needed time to get the trucks running. Everything was frozen. But we made it. You're safe now. Your face, you start to say, is damaged, yes, but I have a face. You have most of your toes. Dmitri has all his fingers. We won. We didn't lose. It's an interesting definition of winning, but he's right. You're alive. That's the only metric that matters. Svetlana is being loaded into one of the trucks, protesting that she's fine, that others need help more, but the rescue team is having none of it. Dmitri is already in another truck, and you're being carried because you can't walk properly, to the third vehicle. The truck interior is warm. Genuinely, impossibly warm. Heated by a diesel stove that's burning with the profligacy of people who have fuel to spare. You're laid on a bench, covered in blankets, modern synthetic blankets, not reindeer hides, and someone hands you hot tea from an actual thermos. Through the truck window, you watch the research station recede into the distance. The building that was your entire world for 3 days becomes just another gray box in the vast white landscape, already being reclaimed by snow and cold. The drive to Oymyakon takes 90 minutes, the trucks moving in convoy, helping each other through difficult sections. You drift in and out of awareness, too exhausted and relieved to maintain full consciousness. Oymyakon, when you arrive, is barely larger than you remembered. A handful of buildings, a few hundred people, all living their lives in conditions you now understand with intimate, terrible clarity. There's a small medical clinic where you're taken immediately, where a doctor who's seen 10,000 cases of frostbite examines your foot and delivers the verdict. 2 toes will probably be fine with proper care. The third, your second toe, the longest, will likely require amputation. The tissue damage is too extensive, and in a facility this remote, risking infection isn't viable. The amputation can wait until you're evacuated to Yakutsk, where there are proper surgical facilities, but it's almost certainly necessary. You absorb this information with surprising calm. You're losing a toe. You'll walk with a permanent limp. You'll have a story to tell for the rest of your life, but you're alive to tell it. In the adjacent room, Svetlana is being examined and is apparently refusing all treatment except tea and a place to rest. Dmitri is having his fingers examined, superficial frostbite, painful but no permanent damage expected. Alexei's facial frostbite is more serious. He might lose part of his nose, might have permanent scarring, but he'll heal. Yulia appears at your bedside. Her hypothermia has been treated, she's warm and fed, and she's already smoking another cigarette because some habits survive even extreme trauma. They're arranging helicopter evacuation tomorrow, she says. Weather permitting, you, me, and Alexei will fly to Yakutsk for proper medical treatment. Dmitri and Svetlana are staying, they insist they're fine, and honestly, they probably are. 70 years of Yakutian life makes you harder to kill. Did we really survive that? You ask.
Minus 85 degrees?
3 days with no real shelter. We really did, Yulia confirms. The meteorological station confirmed it. That cold snap was the worst in 40 years, possibly the worst ever recorded for that duration. We survived something that kills most people. We should probably feel triumphant. I mostly feel tired, you admit. Survival is exhausting, Yulia agrees. The adrenaline, the constant vigilance, the physical and psychological stress. It'll take weeks to really process what happened. Months, maybe, possibly years. Svetlana appears in the doorway, looking remarkably energetic for someone who just survived multiple days in extreme cold. She speaks in Yakut, Dmitri translating into Russian for Yulia, who translates to English for you, a chain of languages that somehow makes the message more powerful. She says you did well. You listened, you learned, you adapted. You didn't panic, didn't make stupid decisions born of fear. You treated the cold with respect, and it allowed you to live. Not everyone survives their first real Yakutian winter. You should feel proud. Coming from her, this is high praise. You try to respond, but emotion clogs your throat. Relief and gratitude and delayed terror all hitting at once. Svetlana smiles, pats your shoulder with a grandmother's affection, and shuffles off to argue with the doctors about whether she needs observation. The rest of the day passes in a blur of medical procedures, warm food, and the strange disorientation of being suddenly safe after being in mortal danger. Your body doesn't quite believe it yet. You keep startling awake, checking for fires, monitoring extremities, before remembering you're in a heated building with doctors and real beds. Tomorrow you'll fly to Yakutsk. After that, to Moscow, probably for the toe amputation and recovery. Eventually, home to wherever home is, carrying scars and stories and a profound new understanding of human fragility and resilience. But tonight, you're in Oymyakon, the coldest inhabited place on Earth, where people somehow build lives in conditions that would kill most humans within hours. You're alive, damaged but alive, having survived something you shouldn't have. Outside, the temperature is minus 82 degrees. The aurora is dancing again, beautiful and indifferent. And inside, in the warmth, you sleep the exhausted sleep of someone who negotiated with death and won. Barely, expensively, but won. The helicopter arrives 2 days later than promised because in Yakutia, schedules are suggestions and weather is sovereign. You spend those days in Oymyakon's small clinic, a Soviet-era medical facility that's seen better decades but still functions with the stubborn competence of people who've learned to make do with limited resources. Your foot is elevated, packed in sterile dressing, monitored hourly for signs of infection that would turn a toe amputation into something far more serious. The waiting gives you time to observe life in the coldest inhabited place on Earth, and what you observe is both mundane and remarkable. Children walk to school bundled like Arctic explorers, laughing and throwing snowballs despite the minus 75-degree cold. The local market operates normally, vendors selling frozen fish that don't need refrigeration because everything outside is a freezer. People go about their lives with the casual acceptance of those who've made peace with impossible conditions. Dmitri visits daily, bringing small gifts, carved pieces of mammoth ivory, traditional Saka patterns etched into bone, objects of beauty created by people who understand that art matters even, especially, in harsh environments. He's become something between a friend and a spiritual teacher, though you share maybe 50 words of common language. Some lessons transcend vocabulary. Svetlana brings food, because of course she does. Fish soup, berry preserves, bread somehow baked in conditions where yeast shouldn't even activate. She checks your foot with clinical detachment, nods approvingly at the healing progress of the 2 salvageable toes, and speaks matter-of-factly about the one that's definitely dying. Through Yulia's translation, she explains traditional amputation techniques, how the Saka people performed emergency surgery centuries before modern medicine, using sharp bone tools and cauterization with hot metal, treating infection with specific plant compounds. I'm not suggesting we use those methods on you, Yulia translates with a grin. Modern surgery is better, but she wants you to know that people survived losing limbs to frostbite for thousands of years. You'll survive too. You'll adapt. The body finds new balance. Alexei is struggling more than he admits. His facial frostbite has progressed to partial thickness necrosis. He's definitely losing part of his nose, possibly sections of both cheeks. The scarring will be permanent and disfiguring. He handles this news with a kind of fatalistic humor that might be genuine acceptance or might be shock-delayed processing. I'll tell people I fought a bear, he says, or survived an avalanche, or got in a knife fight defending a beautiful woman's honor. The truth, that I froze my face off walking 7 kilometers in bad weather, isn't nearly as romantic, but beneath the jokes you can see the grief. He keeps touching his damaged face, feeling the dead tissue, confronting the permanent alteration of his appearance. The psychological scars may take longer to heal than the physical ones. Yulia has thrown herself into documentation mode, interviewing everyone involved in the rescue, recording details for what she's calling a case study in extreme cold survival. She's already planning a paper, possibly a book, about the experience. Her scholarly instinct to analyze and categorize is her way of processing trauma, turning lived horror into data points and narrative structure. The thing about survival stories, she tells you one evening, both of you sitting in the clinic's common room drinking tea, is that they're always shaped by who tells them and when. Right now, we're triumphant survivors. We beat the odds. But in 6 months, when the shock fades and the medical bills arrive and you're learning to walk with a missing toe, the story might feel different. Less heroic adventure, more preventable disaster. Historians still argue about which frame is more accurate. She continues, lighting another cigarette. Are survival stories genuinely about human resilience? Or are they about human stupidity creating dangerous situations that require resilience? Probably both. We wouldn't have needed to survive extreme cold if we hadn't been in extreme cold to begin with. But once we were there, we did something remarkable. She's right, but you're not ready to interrogate the experience yet. You're still in the immediate aftermath phase, where simply being warm and fed and safe feels like victory enough. The helicopter, when it finally arrives, is a Mi-8, a Soviet-designed workhorse that's been flying in Siberian conditions since the 1960s. The pilot is a woman in her 50s who introduces herself as Katia and who has the calm, competent demeanor of someone who's performed 10,000 dangerous flights and treats each one as routine. Weather window is 4 hours, she says in accented English. We go now or we wait maybe 3 more days. Your choice. It's not really a choice. You, Yulia, and Alexei are loaded aboard with your minimal possessions. Dmitri and Svetlana come to see you off, and the goodbye is both brief and weighted with significance. Dmitri places his hand on your shoulder, says something in Yakut that Yulia translates as either walk carefully in the world or may the spirits protect your journey. The phrase apparently has multiple meanings. Svetlana embraces each of you, fierce grandmother hugs that communicate more than words. To you specifically, she gives one final piece of advice through Yulia. Remember what the cold taught you. Not the fear you can forget, but the lessons about limits, about adaptation, about the bargains you make to survive. Those lessons will serve you in warm places too. Then the helicopter's rotors are spinning, and you're lifting off and Oymyakon is shrinking below you. A tiny cluster of buildings in an endless expanse of white, impossibly remote, impossibly inhabited. From the air, it looks like a settlement on an alien planet, and in a sense this is human life at the absolute edge of what Earth's environment can support. The flight to Yakutsk takes 3 hours, flying over landscape that's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The taiga stretches to every horizon, interrupted occasionally by frozen rivers that look like white scars across the land. You see no signs of human presence for vast stretches. No roads, no buildings, no evidence that humans exist at all. This is the taiga as it's existed for millions of years, indifferent to human concerns, vast beyond comprehension. Yakutsk, when it appears, feels like returning to civilization even though it's still one of the coldest cities on Earth, currently sitting at a balmy -42 degrees Celsius. The helicopter lands at a medical facility that actually has modern equipment. Digital thermometers, sterile operating rooms, antibiotics that aren't decades old. You're admitted immediately. The toe amputation is scheduled for the next morning. No point in delaying, the tissue is clearly non-viable, and the sooner it's removed, the lower the infection risk. The surgeon who examines you is straightforward about the procedure: local anesthesia, clean cut through the metatarsal joint, cauterization, stitching, done. You'll be walking within a week, possibly sooner. You're lucky it's just one toe, the surgeon says clinically. I've amputated entire feet, hands, noses. Frostbite is common here. You got off relatively easy. That night, your last night with all 10 toes, you can't sleep. The hospital room is warm, almost too warm after days of cold, and quiet except for the rhythmic beep of monitoring equipment. You find yourself thinking about everything that led to this moment. The documentary assignment that went wrong, the stranded helicopter, the research station, the fire, the fishing expedition, the rescue. If even one element had been different, if the weather had been slightly warmer, if Dmitri hadn't known about the fishing lake, if Svetlana hadn't had her emergency cash, if the rescue had been delayed even one more day, you'd likely be dead, or critically injured, or evacuated with far more severe amputations. The randomness is almost harder to process than the suffering. You survived partly through smart decisions and traditional knowledge, yes, but also through blind luck. The luck that Dmitri happened to be at the station, the luck that the weather stabilized when it did, the luck that your frostbite progressed slowly enough to remain treatable. Yulia visits before the surgery, bringing contraband cigarettes and unauthorized chocolate. "How are you feeling?" she asks. "Honestly, numb, and not just the toe." She nods understanding. Delayed trauma response. It'll hit harder later, probably. For me, it's been dreams. I keep dreaming I'm back in the station, watching the fire die, knowing I'm going to freeze. I wake up panicking, checking the temperature. Before I remember, I'm safe. "Will it get better?" you ask. "Eventually," she says. "Probably. Humans are resilient. Our brains are designed to process and file away trauma. But it takes time. And it changes you. You'll never take warmth for granted again. You'll never be casual about weather. You'll probably develop weird obsessions about backup heating sources and emergency supplies." She's trying to be reassuring, but she's also right. This experience has rewritten something fundamental in your psychology. You're not the same person who stepped off that plane in Oymyakon 5 days ago. The surgery the next morning is exactly as straightforward as promised. Local anesthesia, 20 minutes of cutting and cauterizing that you can feel as pressure but not pain, efficient stitching, bandaging. The surgeon holds up the amputated toe. You hadn't asked to see it, but he shows you anyway. A gray-purple thing that barely looks like it was ever part of your body. "We'll send it for tissue analysis," he says. "Standard protocol. But you're done. You can start rehabilitation tomorrow." And just like that, you're a 9-toed person. The physical change is minimal, your balance will adapt, your gait will adjust slightly, you'll need to buy shoes with consideration for the altered foot structure. But the psychological weight is enormous. Your body carries permanent evidence of those 3 days in Yakutia. You'll never be able to forget or minimize what happened. Every time you take off your shoes, you'll remember. Recovery proceeds with medical efficiency. Physical therapy teaches you to walk with the new configuration. Antibiotics prevent infection. Within a week, you're cleared to fly to Moscow for further evaluation and, eventually, home. Alexei has his own surgery, debridement of necrotic facial tissue, skin grafts, reconstruction that will require multiple follow-up procedures. He'll be in Yakutsk for weeks, possibly months. When you visit him before your departure, he's sedated and bandaged, barely recognizable, but he manages a thumbs up when he sees you. "Still here," he mumbles through the bandages. Still alive. That's something. That's everything. You correct. Yulia is staying in Yakutsk to continue her research and to compile the documentation of your survival story. She's already got notebooks full of observations, interview transcripts, meteorological data. The academic paper will probably be published within a year. The book will take longer. I'll send you the manuscript for review, she promises. You should have input on how your story is told. Your story. It's strange to think of 3 days of suffering and fear and desperate survival as a story, something with narrative structure and meaning. But that's what humans do. We turn experience into narrative, chaos into order, trauma into tales we can process and share. The flight out of Yakutsk feels surreal. You're leaving behind the coldest inhabited places on Earth, returning to what you now think of as the normal world where temperatures are measured in normal ranges and frostbite is a rare emergency rather than a constant risk. You're leaving behind Dmitry and Svetlana, who saved your life through knowledge and generosity. You're leaving behind part of your body, cremated in a medical incinerator according to standard disposal protocols. But you're alive. Damaged, altered, permanently changed, but alive. The plane climbs through -40-degree air, and you watch Yakutsk disappear below. This city built on permafrost, where buildings stand on stilts to prevent their heat from melting the frozen ground beneath, where people have somehow constructed lives in a place that actively resists human habitation. You think about what Svetlana said, remember what the cold taught you, and you realize the lessons aren't just about survival techniques or traditional knowledge. They're about human limits and human adaptability, about the thin margin between life and death, about the importance of community and traditional wisdom, about respecting forces larger than yourself, about the bargains you make to survive. You'll carry these lessons forward into whatever comes next: career, relationships, the simple daily acts of living in a world that suddenly feels both more fragile and more precious than before. You survived -85 degrees Celsius. You survived losing part of yourself. You survived learning that you're simultaneously more vulnerable and more resilient than you ever imagined. The plane levels off. You close your eyes, and for the first time in days, you sleep without checking for fires, without monitoring extremities, without the hypervigilance that extreme survival demands. You sleep with the knowledge that the cold is behind you now. Well, geographically behind you. Psychologically, it'll take longer to leave. Maybe it never fully will. Maybe you'll carry a small frozen place inside yourself forever. A reminder of 3 days when the temperature dropped to impossible numbers and you discovered what you're made of. And maybe that's okay. Maybe carrying that cold place, that memory, that knowledge is the price of survival. A price you'll pay gladly, every day, for the rest of your 9-toed life. The dreams will come later, of course. Months from now, safe in your warm home, thousands of kilometers from Yakutia, you'll wake from sleep convinced you're freezing, convinced the fire is dying, convinced you need to check your toes right now before they turn black. And you'll reach down in the darkness, touch the empty space where that second toe used to be, and the absence will remind you. It already happened. You survived. The worst is over. But tonight, on this flight carrying you away from the coldest places on Earth, you let yourself simply rest. Let your body finally truly believe it's safe. Let the tension drain from muscles that have been clenched for days. Let warmth, ordinary, miraculous warmth, seep into bones that learned what extreme cold feels like at the cellular level. Outside the airplane window, the sun is setting over the endless Siberian taiga, painting the snow in those same impossible colors you watched from the research station. Orange and purple and gold, beautiful and indifferent, ancient light on ancient land. And inside, you're warm, federal safe, missing a toe but carrying a story, changed but alive. The engines hum their steady reassurance. The other passengers doze or read or stare at screens, unaware that among them sits someone who negotiated with death at -85 degrees and won. One at a cost, yes, but one. Your eyes grow heavy. The cabin lights dim for night flight, and you drift into sleep, finally, peacefully, knowing that when you wake you'll still be warm, still be safe, still be alive. The fire is behind you now, but you'll remember, always, what it taught you about light in darkness, warmth in cold, and the stubborn, beautiful persistence of human life at the very edge of what's possible. Rest now. You've earned it.